For context, my grandparents got this big suburban house in the 80s for a really low price and decided to build a pool on the second floor to it and whatnot. When I say the house was big, I mean it was big. A large basement with wine cellar, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, an office, 2 living rooms, huge kitchen/dining room and a pool house/bar on the first floor, 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a balcony terrace, and a living/dining room on the second floor. My family moved in when the construction was still going on, and weird-ass things started to happen. Like a drill going max power being unplugged, or things disappearing and appearing again in strange and odd places. But my family would always joke about the house being haunted, and never really did anything about it. At some point, it got pretty insane, and my grandpa took a bottle of holy water, and that was it. Ever since I remember, I've had this strange, uneasy feeling about the house, and particularly about some rooms within it, like I was never alone and was being watched, but I always brushed it off, thinking that I was just being a silly girl. At some point, I got to completely avoid going into these places. I was maybe 3 or 4 when I had this dream. I was playing at the bottom of the stairs and some shadowy figure started growing from the floor. I remember I was just watching it slowly materialize itself in front of me, until it looked like a man with a hat and evil eyes, all black. A few years ago, researching over the web, I realized it was a shadow man. He had his hand stretched over towards me and was about to say something when I woke up, shaken and scared to death. I sometimes saw this figure standing on the hallway, so I avoided going there by myself as much as I could. When I was 7, I moved to the room besides the stairs on the second floor. This is one of the rooms that made me feel uneasy. I would always find my stuff misplaced around my room, and my lamps and radio unplugged, but I didn't really pay attention to it. Staying in this room, my nightmares and creepy dreams intensified. I remember clearly waking up starving pretty early on a Sunday morning, and when I tried to get up, I fell into a void and woke up really scared. When I finally stopped shaking, I tried to get up again just to end up going into the void once more. This went on 5 times, and I was so scared that I eventually stopped trying to get up until my mum went to wake me up a few hours later. Another time, I was sitting in the kitchen with my grandma late one night. Everyone else was asleep, and we were chatting about life when she sewed some pillows for the sofa. When she was done, she piled the pillows over a counter where there were 4 of them, and made some tea for us to keep talking. We were laughing and everything, when all of a sudden the pillows flew across the kitchen, as if they were angrily tossed and crushed at the laundry room door, which was above the basement, another room that freaked me out. When I was 11 years old, and it was about 11 p.m. on a school night, I turned off all the lights and went to bed. Just a few minutes passed, so there wasn't a real chance that I was dreaming when I heard a rhythmic tapping on my window. It was soft at first and then a bit louder. Keep in mind, this was upstairs. I slowly turned around to the window, and through the curtains I saw this rather tall and lean humanoid figure with a long, thin head and a 3-fingered hand tapping on my window. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran to my mum's bedroom. I remember she checked my room and everything was normal, so my grandpa and uncle checked the whole yard and found nothing. I obviously didn't sleep that night and stayed in my mum's room for at least a week. After that episode, I switched bedrooms. My new room had a walk-in closet where my grandma kept the towels, sheets, and some really old stuff that we never used, so its door was mainly closed. The door had a latch on the outside that was impossible to open from the inside of the closet. One afternoon when I was about 14, I was heading home alone, playing video games after school when I heard this loud bang coming from the closet. I immediately froze and looked at the door. Then it started to sound as if someone was desperately trying to take down the door, so I noped my way downstairs and waited for my mum. One afternoon when I was 15, I came back from school starving, as only a teen would, so I went directly to the kitchen. As far as I knew, I was alone. When I was almost done fixing myself a sandwich, I hear a loud bang upstairs and almost immediately heard my mum scream in absolute terror, so I obviously ran upstairs to check on her. We caught each other on the stairs. She was pale as ever and shaking, so I took her down to calm her down. As soon as she could speak to me again, she said she was watching TV in her room when she heard the same noise I heard. She startled and looked at the window and saw the shadow man floating outside her window, hence her scream and the running downstairs. We ended up leaving that house about 17 years ago. I still remember a couple nightmares I had back then regarding the house, and even now sometimes in my dreams, I still feel that house, and those feelings return. It creeps me out. At the time of this story, I was 14 years old and living in Germany with my mother, father, brother, and a dog. My family and I are British, but we've been living in Germany for a few years at this point due to my father's work. It was great. We had an awesome house, lots of friends, and the going was good. To make it even more amazing, my parents were wrapping up the sale of our old house in the UK, which had been on the market for what felt like forever, and selling it from overseas had just become a massive headache for my parents. The closing of this house sale would not only allow my parents to finally relax, but it was going to pay for the holiday of a lifetime. I'm talking white sand, crystal clear blue oceans, elephant rides, staying in a cabin on the beach, the whole 9 yards. Finally, the offer had been made, the paperwork printed and signed, and to say we were excited was an understatement. This must have been around summertime, as I remember we were due to start back at school in a few weeks. So rather than waiting another 12 months before the next summer break, we planned the holiday for the Christmas period instead. No cold, snow, or freezing wind for us. A short time passed and I came home one day, and my brother and I knew something bad had happened. My dad had come home early from work. There were many phone calls being made, and my mother looked absolutely furious. "What happened?" I asked Mum, hoping to God I wasn't in trouble. "He pulled out," my mother stormed as she slammed the pots down to get dinner ready. The bloody actually pulled out of buying the house. Can you believe it? "What? No!" my brother and I both exclaimed. "Yes, so after signing everything, he then has the cheek to ask us to drop the asking price about 5k. I don't bloody think so. He can forget it." My mother calmed down after a bit and sadly told us that it would mean no exotic holiday. We had to stay home instead. We reassured her it was fine despite feeling incredibly disappointed. My brother was 8 at the time and we were really close, so we'd already planned all these amazing activities that we were going to do while we were out there. So sadly the sale was called off and we stayed home for Christmas. The year, however, was 2004. And our destination? The coastline of Sri Lanka. I woke up that Boxing Day only to be greeted by the horror of the most destructive and deadly tsunami in living memory. The coastline, the homes and businesses, and almost 250,000 people just suddenly wiped away in the blink of an eye. I was glued to the TV for most of that day, too horrified to look away, just watching the death toll rise and rise. Newscasters kept showing the before and after photos, and I recognized the wooden cabins we wanted to stay at. We never would have stood a chance. I'm 29 now, and to this day still carry an enormous sense of guilt, and I try to avoid talking about it whenever weird events come up in conversation. So to the bloke who messed up our house deal and ruined our family holiday, thank you for saving our lives. Back in my early 20s, I moved to Melbourne to go to university. Because of some of my dodgy mates I knew from outside of my uni, I somehow wound up as a go-to guy for drugs with my classmates. I hated the reputation, but maybe felt a little bit cooler at the same time. Ecstasy and speed mostly. I was at the bottom of the drug dealer food chain, the type of idiot who jacks the price up $10 a pill so he can make enough to drink and party. I had no guilt ripping these people off. They were mostly rich kids who lived with their parents and didn't have a job to support them through uni. Dealing them drugs was so easy and non-threatening. A few years after I finished uni, I was working an office job that was boring and paid peanuts. By now, my friends and I had pretty much grown out of the desire to take drugs on weekends. Dinner parties with good friends, good wine, and good conversation was more of our idea of fun. My drug dealing days had well and truly finished, or so I thought. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I just got home from a draining day at work and was exhausted and in a bad mood. I plonked myself on the couch and stared at the ceiling, trying to muster up the energy to get up and shower before bed. My phone starts flashing and vibrating on the coffee table next to me. I looked at the caller ID, and it was T-Bone, the nickname I had for a guy who I met at a festival years ago, and ended up spending a bit of time with here and there. He was a huge, friendly, weed-smoking, acid-tripping hipster with an impressive beard. I hadn't spoken to this guy in well over a year, so when I saw his caller ID on my phone, I immediately thought, he needs drugs. I answered and we exchanged some pleasantries, and then I could hear the tone of his voice changing to that awkward, "Hey, could I ask you a favor?" tone. He wanted drugs, and lots of them, $2,000 worth to be precise. When I asked him what specifically he wanted, he just said as many eckies and bags of speed as that can get. This was way outside my comfort zone. Even when I was dealing back in uni, 10 pills was usually the maximum I would offer at any one time. It was late, I was tired, but I was also broke, and figured that I could clear an easy $500 after purchasing from one of my guys I used to buy from. Something which T-Bone didn't need to know. I told T-Bone that I would call him back and see what I could do. To my surprise, the first person I called was Stover. He would be able to help me out, and he was only a 5-minute drive away. We discussed the terms and conditions which seemed reasonable. 60 E's and 3 grams of speed for $1,500. I called T-Bone, and he was happy to part with his $2,000 for this amount. I met Stover out of his luxurious apartment building. We had a quick chat, and he joked about wanting to meet the guy I'm selling to. We shook hands, and I was on my way to T-Bone. I asked T-Bone where he wanted to meet, and he told me where he was. I Google mapped the address, and it was a 45-minute drive from me. Had I known he was this far, I wouldn't have agreed to sell him anything, but I couldn't back out now. The address he gave me was in what is probably the worst neighborhood in Australia, known for its violent crimes, murder, and of course drug dealing. Irony. For anyone hearing this outside of Australia, they certainly don't know this run-down little hellhole in the tourist brochures. I also won't mention the name of the place because I don't wish to offend anyone who might happen to live there. I started the journey. I now had plenty of time to think about how stupid I am. I had a ridiculously illegal amount of drugs on me, driving out to the roughest neighborhoods in the country. After ages of sitting on the freeway, I took the exit and was approaching my destination. At this point I was so tired that I was in almost a dreamlike state. Every set of lights I pulled up to, people in cars next to me would give me greasy looks, trying to act hard and start confrontations. I pulled into the street where the house was. My phone chimed the familiar, "Your destination is on the left." Thanks, phone. The street was so dark because the street lights were out, and there was cloud cover and no moon. I couldn't see anything. The houses in this street looked dilapidated and abandoned. This didn't feel right. The house that T-Bone said he was at had boarded up front windows with terrible graffiti tags on them, and there weren't any lights on. I called T-Bone and got no answer. I redialed and thought it was about to ring out when he picked up. "Hey T-Bone, I'm out front." "Oh, cool. Come on in." "No, come out to the car." "Hang on a sec," he said and then hung up. I was thinking, crap, I hardly know this guy. He's been to a few parties I went to, we hung out, but I didn't know anything about him. I saw him emerge from the side of the house, pushing through bushes that blocked the pathway. I was the only car parked on the street. He saw me and gestured for me to come over. I had no idea who he was with, so I thought it was time to get into character. I took my jacket off so I was only wearing a white singlet and put my filthy black trucker cap on that I kept in the glove box. I was hoping this would give me a look that said, "Don't mess with me." My friends often joke about how I look tougher than I am. I have some football and kickboxing induced facial scars combined with a pretty big physique from smashing weights for years. I was big enough and scary looking enough to be intimidating, but truth be known, I'm really a marshmallow who avoids confrontations. I shook hands with T-Bone in the front yard of this place, and felt at ease when he gave me a happy greeting and thanked me for coming out all this way. He told me to follow him, and we went through the bushes around the back of this place. I could hear music, sounds like they were pumping dubstep through crappy distorting speakers. I could hear a few people's voices and I could smell cigarette smoke. T-Bone ripped the back door open and the smell and sound hit me harder. I've been to some nasty house parties, but this was horrific. There were 3 of them in the kitchen. There was a flashlight attached by a string to the 12-foot ceiling, swinging back and forth in a slow pendulum style. It was the only lighting. The swinging light made it difficult to see the people in the kitchen, but with each sway I would catch a glimpse of their faces. They were absolute toothless junkies, all shirtless, skinny, with bad tattoos. We entered the kitchen and one of them closed the door behind us and stood in front of it, arms folded, as if he were guarding it. One of them came forward and told me his name was Jay. Not like he was introducing himself, it was more of a statement. His face looked like he'd been on meth for years. He sized me up and then looked at T-Bone and said, "I thought you said he was small." T-Bone looked at him in total shock. As Jay turned to T-Bone, the flashlight swung past and I noticed he was holding a big screwdriver behind his back. Now I realized what was happening, and I felt like an idiot. I've walked into an ambush. Get a guy with a crap load of drugs to come around and rob him. Jay turned back to me. He was about 6 feet away from me and he showed me the screwdriver and said, "What have you got for me?" with a big front tooth missing smile. The fact I was so tired and pissed off kind of worked for me because I didn't show that I was actually bricking it. I squared up to him and said in a no-nonsense tone, "Give me all the cash and I'll show you." To which Jay replied, "Nah, can't. Didn't T-Bone tell ya? These were on the tick, mate." On the tick, meaning I'll pay you later, or never in this case. I looked at T-Bone, who looked back at me and shook his head and mouthed, "I'm sorry." Jay looked at me with such hatred, it looked as though he was in pain. "Give us your gear." It wasn't so dark in this hellhole. He could have easily seen over my inflated pockets, where I'd stashed everything. I looked at the guy in front of the door, and as soon as our eyes met, he put his arm over the door handle, confirming that he wasn't going to let me leave. We all stood there trading glances. The swinging light made everyone's shadows look like they were moving. Jay didn't like this. T-Bone broke the silence and said, "Jay, chill out. I'll get the money." And he left to the kitchen. I thought he was going to bail on me. Who has 2K cash just lying around? Jay slowly came towards me, pointing the screwdriver at me. He said in a raspy, matter-of-fact tone, "I'll kill ya. I'll do the time. Just try me." "That's cute," I reply. Then the painful anger came back to his face. I've never seen anything like it. I slowly put my feet into a fighting stance to prepare myself for what was about to happen. T-Bone walked back in and said, "Here's the cash," which briefly diffused the situation. I did a quick count. 1,700. Close enough. I threw the envelope of gear to Jay and the door guard moved and I got the hell out of there. T-Bone followed me and tried to give me an apology. Mate, I had no idea that was going to happen. I'm so sorry. I just said, you owe me $300 and drove away. I never got the extra 300 and I never dealt drugs again. I also thankfully never met Jay again. Around 4 years ago when I was 13, me and my family went on a vacation to Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. We had gone there several times in the past since it was usually low priced and a nice way to get away from our cold Canadian winters. We were staying at an all-inclusive resort near the ocean. This resort had a lot of things to do during the night, like shows and whatnot. 3 days into our trip, my family went to go see a show. We were all having a fun time, until I started to get a really bad headache, and my parents noticed this, telling me that I should lie down in our room. I agreed and they handed me a key card. As I was walking into the elevator, a tall Hispanic man walked in with me. He was wearing what seemed to be a dirty jacket and ripped jeans, and also had a big, dark beard that was uncombed and looked very frizzy. I pushed the button for the 7th floor, and he just stood still, leading me to think his room was there too. He then started asking me questions like how old I was, and how long was I staying there. I answered normally, but then he asked where the rest of my family was. My answer was one of the worst things I've ever done in my life. I responded with, watching the show downstairs, and as I got off, he started following me down the hallway, which I started sweating and freaking out over. As I was approaching my room, I kind of squeaked and asked, "Where are you going?" And he said, "Back to my room." Now shaking as I put the key card in the door lock, he seemed to be turning around, facing the other room across from me. As soon as the door opened, he turned and charged at me. Because I was looking back, I saw him, ran into the room, and tried shutting the door, but he got to it first. Now it was me and him alone in the hotel room. He had what looked to be a knife or shank, and he was slowly walking towards me and said, "Be quiet, or I'll kill you." As I was in the back of the room, he was getting closer, and I threw the lamp at him and rushed to get around and out the room. He cut my arm pretty deep, but I was sprinting out the room to get to the stairwell. As I got to the lobby, I ran to my family, crying and screaming for help. After that, I got stitches on my arm, and my mum still doesn't forgive herself for not coming with me to the room. The hotel offered us an upgrade to the nice suite, and we took it, but were very paranoid for the rest of the trip. We later found out he was a homeless man that just came through the doors of the hotel. He stole my laptop and my backpack, which were in the open, and then fled to the lobby and out the doors. I started my first job at Tim Hortons when I was 16, and worked there for many years through high school and university. I could probably add about 10 stories here about inappropriate regulars, but this is the one that really haunts me. I was about 17 to 18 at the time, and worked at a local that was only about 10 minutes down the street from my parents' home. A neighbor called Alex lived roughly 8 houses down, and started coming in regularly for coffee and small talk with me. Alex was at least 45 to 50, and it turns out he used to work with my dad and had lived in my neighborhood for years. Nothing about our conversation seemed weird or alarming to me. After a few months of completely normal interactions, he found me on Facebook. I accepted, because I was young and had no social media boundaries at the time. This is when things started to get weird. He would DM me about things I was posting instead of commenting publicly. He would offer me rides to work or class, and would make comments about my hair, makeup and curves. I found out he was married and has a son a few years younger than me. I started ignoring his messages and eventually removed him as a friend. When he came in for his coffees after this, he would ask for my number, wouldn't take no for an answer, and just generally made me feel uncomfortable. I started asking co-workers to serve him, and my manager at the time refused to ban him from the store. I also learned that he used to send a past employee flowers and do the same thing to her. Fast forward a few months. Alex seemed to have gotten the hint and stopped asking for me when he came into my workplace. One evening I was walking my dog around the subdivision and smoking some weed, as I did most nights before bed, and I walked the same route each night, which unfortunately meant I had to pass by his home. On my way back this night, I saw him out of the corner of my eye coming out of his house with a baseball bat. He stood in his front yard for a few minutes, and then I could hear him start walk behind me, and I panicked. I was also high and unsure if I should be alarmed. Was this a time to panic? Some kids in the duplex across the street started banging on the window and making a bunch of noise. I was too scared to even look up at them. My dog started getting agitated, and I decided to start running since I was only 2 minutes from home, and figured I could make it inside and lock the door. Alex must have been spooked by the noise and stopped following me. I'm very thankful for those kids who knew that situation did not look right and tried to warn me. It worries me to think about what could have happened if they hadn't. Alex, let's not meet. Ever. My parents bought their first house back in 1972. It was a fixer-upper, but they decided to move in right away and fix things when time and money permitted. Within a few days of moving there, the new neighbors came over to introduce themselves. They also let my parents know that the previous owners had moved out after a nasty divorce. They had lost their second child to SIDS, and their relationship went downhill from there. My parents were horrified, more so because they were newly pregnant and couldn't imagine going through such a thing. They eventually pretty much forgot all about it. Life went on, and they were in love with their new life and their new house. In preparation for the baby, they decided to wallpaper the nursery. Now my dad told my mum there was no need in wallpapering the inside of the closet, but she insisted. She was kneeling down, scraping off old paint inside the closet when her eyes fell upon something that made her blood turn to ice. Written in crayon, about the eye level for a kindergartner, in childish scrawl was written, "I killed the baby." This was a few years ago, on a night scuba dive. There were 8 of us in the group, including our dive master and his assistant. We had just finished our dive and were gathered up in a circle ready to ascend and get out of the water, when my dive master freezes. He takes his flashlight and, pointing it outside our circle of divers, he catches something circling us with the beam. Turns out, it was a 12-foot-long great white shark. At this point, half the group are trying to keep the shark illuminated as it circles us, and remarkably everyone stayed calm. The only thing that went through my mind were iterations of those 2 thoughts. Don't look like a yummy, delicious, fatty seal, and that I hope I taste terrible. My dive master gets our attention and slowly puts his thumb up, and then makes an upwards motion with all of us beginning to ascend, and the shark kept with us until we were maybe 10 feet from the surface. Then it turned off into the darkness and was gone. I did not go back into the ocean for about a week after that. I met Abby on the first day of 2nd grade. I saw her snapping her fingers on the bus seat next to mine. I couldn't snap my fingers, so I was intrigued, and I sat there with her so she could teach me. To this day, I could still only snap my fingers on the hand that she taught me. Our friendship was never like the ones they show in movies. Abby had a pretty hard home life, and eventually fell in with the wrong crowd. She was into drugs, alcohol, and parties, while I was into books, studying, and animals. Still, I felt like it was my job to save her from it. She was, after all, my best friend. The summer before senior year, I was 17, and feeling rebellious. I'd stay more often at Abby's house, where her mum would let us drink in a more safe environment. But then Abby met a guy and started dating him. Ryan. He creeped me out. He was about 5 years our senior and just off. One day, Abby suggested that we go meet up with Ryan and his friend Kyle. It turned out that Kyle was the local drug dealer. I wasn't overly comfortable with this, but I wanted to impress Abby and definitely didn't want to leave her alone with them. They started smoking pot, and eventually I joined them. The hot air combined with the alcohol we'd already consumed made me feel sick, and Abby took me outside to cool off, and I laid down on the lawn. I will admit it, I'm a total lightweight. Pretty soon the guys come out to check on us, and I could hear them laughing and saying something, but honestly in that moment I didn't care. Ryan took us home, and the next morning Abby had told me that my leggings had been sheared, and the guy had been talking about the show I had put on for them. For a while, I refused to be around Ryan or Kyle. They were weird, I didn't like them, and they made me feel super uncomfortable. But I was young and dumb, and going through some tough stuff. When Abby suggested I come round again, even though Ryan was there, I went anyway. Right after I got there, Ryan starts talking about how much Kyle liked me. Not wanting to be rude, I said that was flattering, but that I wasn't interested. Abby suggested to cheer me up that we go to Ryan's house and have some drinks. At this point, even Abby's mum didn't like Ryan being around. I should have known it was a red flag if even she didn't like him. Abby said that they'd have a cute guy come over for me, so I was placated. We get there, start drinking, and Ryle said Kyle was coming over for a moment to liven up the party. I pulled Abby aside and told her how uncomfortable I was with that, but she assured me that he wouldn't stick around long and that my guy would be there soon. Kyle arrives and I'm already smashed. They start smoking and I couldn't stand the smell, so I tell Abby I'm going to lay down for a bit and to come get me when my guy gets here. As I said, I was drunk. I don't hold my alcohol well and barely drink to this day. The next thing I remember, I'm waking up, naked in bed. Kyle is leaning over me with his member in hand. I don't know why, but at that moment I laughed. I guess I just didn't know how to process the information, or perhaps the irony of the situation that I was in. I was depressed that summer due to the fact that I was coming to terms with being sexually abused as a child, and it's ironic that in trying to get over it, it was happening again. My mind works in weird ways. Kyle sits back on his haunches, bewildered, and I scurry out the room to find Abby and tell her what happened. Abby and Ryan were right outside the door and had heard me giggle. As soon as I start freaking out, Abby and Ryan start berating me for laughing at Kyle. I couldn't explain why I'd done it, and I don't even have a rational reason now. Both Abby and Ryan said that after I had laid down for a while, I'd come back in and started making passes at Kyle, so we'd gone back to the room. Being naive and 17, I believed Abby. But I apologized to Kyle, who was now irate, and told him I just wasn't comfortable, and made Abby take me home, and I stopped hanging out with them. Something about the situation just didn't sit right with me. That fall, when school started, a mutual friend came up to me, and what she told me will haunt me for the rest of my life. The first time I had met Kyle, and he had seen the show I put on, he told Ryan and Abby that if he could get me to sleep with him, he would give them free drugs. When Abby realized I wouldn't sleep with Kyle of my own free will, she decided to get me drunk enough to not know better. She was my best friend. I had known her for a decade. Last I heard of Abby, she was in and out of the psych ward. Ryan was abusing her, and he made her drop out of college to support his habits. I don't know what became of Kyle, but honestly, I don't want to know. So Ryan, Abby and Kyle, let's not meet again. I'm in my early 20s. I'm waitress/bartender at a hotel restaurant. Construction workers in our town often stayed at the hotel and would come eat and drink at the restaurant. I met a really tall, cute guy. Not a creep, but ultimately a prick. and whenever he was in town we would hang out and stuff. He lived 2 states over but was in my area a lot. So one time he was working a job and staying in a town the state over, and I drove to meet him. When I got to his hotel, we went to the hotel bar and had a few drinks with some other construction guys that happened to be there, not his company. Then went back to the room. Later we decided to order food from the bar. The prick was in the shower when the bar called, so I went and picked up our food. When I got down there, the guys that we were drinking with earlier were still there and were pretty sauced by this point. The bartender was busy for a while, so I sat and played with the digital slots. One of the construction guys came over and immediately started hitting on me and trying to touch me and put his arm around me and stuff, despite knowing full well I was there with someone else. He kept telling me his room number over and over and had to directly, loudly, tell him to get the hell away from me multiple times, and he finally did only once the others started noticing. In my flustered rage, I grabbed my food from the bartender and went back to the room and told him all about it. He rolled his eyes and kind of shrugged it off, and I was really put off by it all and really felt vulnerable. That's when I realized my phone was gone. I left it on the bar at the slot machine. So the prick and I went looking for it. The guys were all gone, but the bartender told me the creep took my phone and assured him he was going to return it to me. Great. Then I remembered that he had told me his room number. I told the prick this, and he of course passively accused me of asking for it. I didn't care, and marched him to the creep's room. I knocked, and the prick, who's 6'7", stayed to the side out of view of the peephole to see what would happen. The creep way too enthusiastically swung the door open and grabbed my wrist and proceeded to try and pull me into the room. Thank God for the prick, who then stepped behind me and yelled, "Hey!" to the creep, who was half his size, and I'll never forget the look on his face, like he just shat a brick. I yanked my arm and yelled, "Give me my phone." The creep then lied and said he didn't have it and the bartender was lying. The prick didn't do anything else at this point, so we just left. I felt defeated and unsafe and annoyed and just wanted to go, but I couldn't because I didn't have my phone. I managed to sleep a little that night, but woke up at 4:30 when the prick left to go to work. I stayed in the hotel till about 7 and was fuming, and then decided to do something about it. I gathered my stuff and went and found a maintenance man who was working in the pool area. I contemplated telling him the whole story, but decided to just damsel in distress to avoid any more drama. I told him I was leaving and realized I'd locked my phone in my room and gave him the creep's room number. I knew the creep would be already at his job site, so we went to the room and I had the maintenance man call my cell phone from his. Sure enough, you could hear a faint vibration through the door. He took this as proof of it being my room and opened the door and let me in. I thanked him and left. There it was, just sitting on the bathroom counter. My phone. I grabbed it and turned to leave, but decided my petty ass wasn't done yet. I took the creep's toothbrush and ran it along under the toilet room and put it back in the same spot. Then I happily left, phone in hand, and stopped seeing the prick for good. I still smile knowing that the creep had to notice that my phone was gone, but probably had no idea how I got it back, or that he was brushing his teeth with toilet water. I want to start by saying that I still work for this company, and I still have anxiety every time I go to work. The company is huge, one of the biggest names in the world. For the purposes of privacy, let's just call it Big Cheese. I also want to mention that I have crippling social anxiety. I credit this to being homeschooled most of my life, and this will make a lot more sense later. Well, September of last year, I was fresh out of high school and was looking for work. I needed this job immediately because I was living with my significant other and we were barely getting by. My father and grandfather both either worked or had worked for this company for a long period of time, and it was something that garnered a lot of respect in my family. So of course I was thrilled when I got my first interview. It went great and was all set to start training, which involved a few classes and on-the-job training. The classes were awkward to say the least, but nonetheless informative. Well, after the classes had finished, I joined a group of fellow trainees to tour the work environment, and this is where I first met the creepy coworker. He was in the very back of my group, seemed a little shy, and didn't really talk to the rest of the group unless he was trying to make an awkward joke to join in. At first I kind of felt bad for him. He seemed harmless, but definitely awkward and out the loop. Knowing as much as I did going into the company, I made an effort to inform him and update him with all the things the trainers were asking of us. He just seemed so lost and confused. I thought I was doing a good thing by helping him out. Even my significant other thought so at the time. The training went by without any hiccups. As soon as we were given the location of where we'd start out, ironically enough, the only person that I had gotten to know, creepy coworker, had the same area I did. Realizing that we'd be starting out together and both didn't know anyone, we decided to exchange phone numbers. That was so that we could both meet up the next week so that we wouldn't get lost. I thought nothing of this when he asked for my number, and just assumed it was more because he was nervous and didn't know anyone besides me. Boy, did I live to regret that. The first day of training, we met up at basically a flagpole so that we could wait up for the job trainer, Christy. When he got off the employee shuttle, he started texting me asking where I was. I was in the smoking section a little ways away, killing my fears with a cigarette, and messaged him back telling him where I was, and he asked if he could join. I didn't like how nervous it felt, and I wasn't comfortable with anyone joining me during this time of reprieve. But I saw him coming over anyway, so I scooted over to make room on the bench. This didn't matter, because apparently he was going to sit as close to me as possible anyway. I hate touch or people being in my personal bubble, and being a victim of other trauma, touch was something only people very close to me had permission to do. Creepy coworker then proceeded to ask me if he could bum a cigarette, and I'm not that good at saying no, so gave him one. After he lit up and returned my lighter, I just kind of ignored the unwarranted invasion of my space. We talked since and had about 30 minutes to kill, speaking about normal stuff like how do you feel about the company, where do you want to end up in, and noticed he was wearing tattoo covering sleeves, so asked him about them. He pulled down the sleeves and started going over almost each and every one, all something to do with either a love interest or something geeky. I listened out of mild curiosity, but quickly got uncomfortable when he started pulling out his phone and showing me pictures of ones he drew. I was uncomfortable because he kept showing me pictures of himself as well, mostly photos of him shirtless, and I didn't really find that appropriate. He mentioned he was a Marine, and that he had gained too much weight after his last tour. I apologized out of sympathy, but suggested that it was nothing to be ashamed of. Unfortunately, after that, he kept smiling at me in a way I deemed to be admiration. I had seen this look from my fiancé, so I knew somewhere I'd messed up. I quickly turned the conversation to more appropriate stuff, like music taste. He seemed interested in what music I liked too much, and decided he should make a playlist. I said it really wasn't necessary, but he insisted. Later into that very day during training, he kept purposefully doing kind things, like taking heavy boxes from my hands, or taking the odd jobs he deemed too grueling for a lady. I was a little annoyed, but mostly just glad the jobs meant that he'd have to go a different area and give me some space. He'd always find a way back to appear beside me and scare me. I hated being scared, and he laughed it off every time. I was more than uncomfortable. At this point, a nervousness had settled in the pit of my stomach. At the end of the night, after we'd been sent to go home and come back the next day, he decided to walk me out. We'd walk back through the maze my workplace actually is, all the way to the employee costume center/lockers, and it was there that we had gotten our work costume and stored our regular clothes in lockers. Well, I was having trouble remembering the combination and couldn't find the little slip of paper that told me it. A creepy coworker came up to me and smirked, seemingly waiting for me to finish up. I thought he had left at this point and wasn't expecting him to still be there. After a few tries, he reached over and out the combination of my locker for me. This was a serious red flag. He had already memorized my combination, and now I felt as though my privacy was completely gone. Again, I, awkward and unsure of what to do in this situation, was like, "Thank you," but suggested that he let me figure it out next time. I was hoping that he would, so that he would forget my combination. Remember this for later. After changing back into my regular clothes in the girls' locker, I came out and he was still waiting for me. I asked him why he had waited, so he could have just gone home sooner, to which he replied, "Because I'm a gentleman. A lady should be walked to her car so that she can be kept safe." I told him that my significant other was waiting to pick me up. He asked where, and I told him down the street like an idiot. I still don't know why I complied with this creep as much as I did, but I had never been in a situation like this before. He told me that was too far for me to walk, and that it wasn't safe, so he offered to drive me to my significant other's car. Due to how tired I was and how much I ached from the day, I didn't have the strength to argue. I mean, he was creepy, but also nice. I chalked up the creepiness to him just being awkward. So without anything else weird happening, he took me to my significant other, whom I had been texting the entire time, just to let him know where I was and what was going on. I had a deep gut feeling that I should text him everything I knew about the guy, so I did. When I pulled up, I immediately got out the car. My boyfriend sat there leaning against the car with his arms crossed. He wasn't very happy about him giving me a ride, but nonetheless thanked the creepy coworker for getting him to me safely. The coworker nodded, seeming to smirk at my boyfriend the whole time. This was when my boyfriend first got a bad feeling about the guy. So we got home and my boyfriend warned me about him, telling me he wasn't getting a good vibe from him. It was not 3 minutes after that I got a text from the coworker. He started sending me songs and memes and telling me things like, "I really feel like you get me." Now I was definitely concerned. What the hell did I get myself into? Why did I have to be so goddamn nice to people? The following day at work, I was on my last day of training, and I had a massive pain attack. I have a chronic illness, and the situation ended with none of the managers listening to me when I told them that the pain doesn't last and comes and goes. They rushed me to the emergency room. A stretcher carried me through work while I was crying and trying to hide my face. The customers were quick to take out their phones and film the whole thing. It was one of the worst experiences of my life, but what happened next is even worse. I received about 20 texts from the creepy coworker asking how I was. At this point I was done. I just didn't respond, and after a few random memes he started texting me that he was drunk and thinking about not going home to his wife. This was the first time he'd ever mentioned to me he had a wife. I was dumbfounded. Why was he so concerned about me when he had someone else who loved him enough to marry? I didn't respond. I went to bed. In the morning I woke up to my boyfriend looking at my phone in anger. My heart sank and I could only imagine what the creepy coworker had sent now. My boyfriend showed me the only text I had gotten since the night before. It was from his wife texting me from his phone. She wrote a message that the creepy coworker had a problem getting attached to women. She warned me that I should stay away from him, and then told me her name, my name. And after that, she explained that my name was a thing for him. All of his exes had that very same name. Now at that point, my boyfriend was telling me not to go back to this job, that it wasn't worth it. But that's not me. I wasn't going to let one creep ruin this opportunity for me. The job meant the world to me, and I never wanted to let it go. So I told him if this continued, I'd go to HR, but in all honesty, I really didn't want to do that. I was the new girl. I didn't want the first month on the job for me to be fighting a harassment case. Biting my nails the whole way I went to work. Suddenly, the creepy coworker wasn't hovering anymore. I thought this might have been him being embarrassed, and I was pretty convinced I wasn't going to have a problem after that. Big mistake. On my lunch break, he made sure to go on his lunch early and come find me. His normally enthusiastic attitude was gone, replaced with what felt like anger. I was scared. He came up to me and let me know that his wife is full of crap, and just angry because he was divorcing her. At this point, I didn't want to have anything to do with him, so I kept quiet, hoping that he'd take the hint. He told me he had a gift for me and that he'd give it to me after the shift, quickly walking away before I could respond. After my shift, I go outside of the work area to the lockers. I had waited an extra hour and a half, even taking a closing position from a co-worker, just so that he'd go home before me. Well, my lock wasn't locked all the way, and I was now freaked out. I opened the locker to grab my bag and go, but noticed a rolled up piece of drawing paper. I know what kind it is because I am an artist myself. Unrolling it, it was a naked girl that resembled my video game character on World of Warcraft. I had briefly mentioned my WoW addiction to my group on the first group training day. I didn't even realize he had heard any of that, much less memorize the information. Suddenly he walks up, though we should have been long gone by then, and confronts me. He asks me if I like it, and because he seemed angry, I said yes. I suggested he didn't do it anymore as my boyfriend wouldn't like this kind of gift at all. He rolled his eyes and playfully giggled at me as if I were joking with him, but I wasn't. Not only did he follow me the whole way out of the work grounds, he got me to the employee shuttle that I had to get on to have witnesses. He sat right next to me, leaning on me. I felt like a deer in headlights, mentally begging someone to suggest that he shouldn't be that close to me, but no one paid any attention. Instead, I spent the whole drive trying to get this man to pull his arm off my shoulders, and I felt nauseated and my head was spinning. After we got off, I practically dashed off the bus and ran to my boyfriend, who parked the car at the entrance to the employee parking zone. I got in the car and told him to go. He took off and I started crying. I told my boyfriend and he was pissed. He wanted to turn around and punch the creep, but I talked him out of it through tears. I promised that I would talk to my managers after that. Well, I kept looking for the right time to pull a manager aside, but never got a chance. The next night I went in. Now, creepy co-worker's attitude did a whole 180. He was being extremely weird, playful, and then he crossed the final line. He grabbed my butt where consumers could easily see him. The co-workers kind of laughed and thought it was a game. Because of this, I was pissed and pushed to my limit. I went after him. I legitimately punched him in the arse and shouted in his face, "How do you like that, huh?" Seething, he seemed unfazed by my anger. Instead, he laughed it off and winked at me. I went down to the basement for the employee bathroom and quickly threw up the contents of my stomach, cried in the stall and prayed to God that this would stop. I quickly made an excuse, used my chronic illness, and went home. Fast forward a few weeks. He had completely swapped out his shifts so he wouldn't work with me. I felt like I'd won the battle. I sent a message and he realized he'd crossed boundaries. Until the night before Christmas Eve, I had a terrible feeling as my boyfriend was driving me to work that night. I felt gross. I got to work and he was there, flirting with other girls, suddenly having this big ego I'd never seen him display before. Like I said, when I met him, he was shy and awkward. It's like his personality flipped every time I saw him. I never knew which side of him I was going to get on. That night, he actually stomped off, as all the other co-workers, including myself, closed the joint. We were scrubbing like normal, and he didn't seem at all together. So he clocked out early, and I relaxed. I figured he'd gotten in trouble since one of our floor managers seemed to be upset that he'd clocked out without permission. I was there extra late. The evening festivities were done for the night, and my zone was pretty much closed off for consumers. So I walked through the massive property that is my work to get to the street. I had started taking new ways to meet my boyfriend, who picked me up so that I couldn't be followed. This time I was going to walk straight out of the grounds and onto the street where the bus stops, where my boyfriend would be waiting at the curb. I was about halfway through my approximately 12-minute walk, and it was a dark area. And out of nowhere, as I'm sure you've already guessed, the creepy co-worker shows up and starts yelling my name and following me from behind. I pretended not to notice and walked faster. He yells my name again and seems angrier, so I sprint for it. I sprint all the way to cross the shuttle zone and end up crashing into someone's chest. Thank God it was my actual boyfriend, who had a really bad feeling and wanted to be as close to my work as possible. I looked back. The creep got on the shuttle and was staring from the window, smiling like the Cheshire Cat the whole time. Never in my life had I been so terrified. After that, next night was Christmas Eve, and I was supposed to work, but just knew something bad was going to happen. So crying the whole time because I knew I had to earn a bunch of points for calling out to avoid him, I asked, crying, the lady on the phone if I was going to get fired, and she said she honestly couldn't say. I respected that, but I knew I wasn't done. I wasn't going to let this creep make me lose this job I'd worked so hard to get, even changing my appearance to fit their strict standards. No. So I wrote to the only person I could think of, my trainer Christy. She was the lead, and she was the kindest girl you'd ever meet. Gold of heart. You knew just being her friend meant you'd have a trusted confidant for life. I told her everything, sent her screenshots of the texts he sent me, and finally told someone with an ounce of leadership that I was scared to go to work. Immediately she responded and asked if she could tell the managers. And even though I was incredibly nervous, I told her yes. The next day I was pulled in, and God bless my ex-manager Christopher, because he was shocked at everything that had happened to me and quickly helped me write a report for HR. He led me through the steps and even changed the schedule so I wouldn't be working with the creepy coworker unless he specifically traded shifts. 2 months go by, and I'm well acquainted with the responsibilities for my work at this point, and I'm comfortable, but of course there's no stopping a stalker. He had traded a shift and was working the night shifts with me. He was angry every time he looked at me, and I avoided looking at him at all costs. Then around halfway through my shift, I'm down in the basement coming back from the restroom. I'm walking up the steps that lead down to my work area, and then I feel someone behind me. Before I could think a clear thought, I was pushed against the wall, hand beside my head. He leans in and says, "You should smile more," and then he chuckles and walks away. I feel pretty hysterical at this point and run to the closest lead, crying and trying to explain what happened. It was at this point that my manager Christopher, pissed off that HR was taking so long to investigate my case, went to them to speed it up. Well, after 4 months of an interview process with HR, finally the case was resolved. And not only was he let go, but I was doing really well in my job. Nothing to worry me about not paying attention to my duties. Creepy coworker has left me alone ever since, but sometimes I get random friend requests from guys with no picture and always similar names. Creepy coworker, leave me alone. I won't ever be intimidated again, and I will win every battle you throw at me. Let's never meet again. It has long been rumored that the house next to me has been haunted. People would come and go like it was a perpetual revolving door. The longest anyone stayed was about 6 months. It was a normal house, upper middle class, tan with a white picket fence, a good-sized deck and a decent yard. The only thing slightly creepy about this house was that a man who had owned the house for years and moved had buried all of his dead pets in the backyard. So it was an animal graveyard of sorts. It sat empty for quite some time, and this is where my experience begins. I was in high school when it happened, probably my freshman year. I had gotten together with 2 friends, Carol and Erin, and we were trying to figure out what to do to keep from being bored. Someone, maybe it was me, decided to go check the house out and see what all the fuss was about. We walked through the open gate and into the backyard. A cable man had recently come by to do some work, which was very odd since no one lived there. After standing in the yard for a minute, we decided to play hide and seek. We opted to draw the boundary line at the front yard and backyard. Going inside was off limits. I would count and they would hide. Well, I found Carol almost immediately, and she decided to help me find Erin. We looked for a few minutes or so when we heard a noise that sounded like movement in the house, kind of like someone scurrying across the floor. We assumed that our friend had broken the rules and gone inside. "Erin," we shouted at the house, "you know inside's off limits." We expected to hear the door open and Erin come walking out, talking about how she just wanted to look, when we hear her come out the bushes behind us, explaining that it wasn't her in the house. We get a look of horror on our faces, and slowly turn to look at the large window that overlooks the yard. The house is pitch black, so it's impossible to see inside. We aren't looking for very long when I see something directly in front of the window. It was a young girl, maybe 11 or 12. The only thing that was out of place was that she wasn't from this time period. She was wearing a dark dress with a high collar and 2 braids down her back. She looked sad and mouthed something that I understand to be "help me." I can't figure out what she means when I see something behind her that made my blood run cold. It's a man about 6'5" tall and sinister. He had a look of pure hatred on his face, and his hands reach out as if to take the girl standing in front of him. As fast as he appears, they vanish. I come back to reality and turn to look at my friends. They looked like they'd seen a ghost. I turn to my friend Erin and ask what she saw. She describes the little girl exactly, and saw the man as well. We hightailed it out of there as fast as we could, and have never been back. When I was 13, I lived in a small town in rural Zimbabwe. We had a large, single-story house with a massive garden that surrounded the property. On one side of the house, the garden narrowed between our house and the fence of the neighbor's house. At the end of this narrow section was an empty, decrepit, cement-lined pond that I had recently cleared of rubble and plant life with the plan of eventually filling it again. One afternoon, my friend Dan and I were messing around in the garden, and for some reason I found myself running down the narrowed section of garden straight towards the pond. Suddenly, for some reason that I can't really articulate, dread and fear washed over my body like 1,000 needles raining down from the sky. I stopped dead in my tracks about 2 meters from the pond and found myself breathlessly staring at it motionlessly. From the crack on one side of the pond, a long snake, perhaps a meter long, emerged 3 or 4 seconds later. It was a Mozambique spitting cobra, a large, aggressive, and extremely venomous snake that wouldn't hesitate to bite or spit at threats. Like a 13-year-old boy running past its new home in the wall of the pond, for instance. I slowly backed away, and the pond was filled with sand the next day. To this day, I don't know what it was that stopped me dead in my tracks, but if I continued, perhaps I wouldn't be here today. My friend Kari is a very quiet girl. She's extremely nice, but very introverted and reserved. I went to a school with her previous to this one, and we tried to get her involved in events, but she always turned us down and went home to hang out with her grandmother, even in university. She is still expected to call home every night to show that she's safe and in her dorm room. One day, Kari had gotten friendly one lecture with a girl who sat beside her, Danielle. Since they both lived on residence, they walked home together and decided to stop in the dining hall for a chat and some food. Everything was normal until Danielle steered the topic into some rather odd conversation. First, she began telling her how she had been in a mental health facility for trying to kill someone in high school. She began telling my friend that when she first arrived in this city, she traveled downtown at night, hoping to find an intoxicated homeless person that she would be able to overpower and kill. She told my friend of different ways to disembowel cats and offered to show her how to do it. She told my friend of how she wanted to kill different roommates since she first arrived on res, but was too worried she would be caught. She also admitted that the only reason she was taking law and forensics was to learn how to commit crime better. Kari, already shy and timid around normal people, quickly excused herself and left. 5 minutes later, their encounter ended, and I got a Facebook message telling me the entire situation and asking what she should do. I advised her she tell her professor, which she did. Both of us thought the girl needed help, but we assumed that she was probably lying or at least exaggerating in order to get attention. A few days later, I got another message from Kari telling me about the events that followed. After Kari told the professor, she was called in the next day by police. The school took the threats and claims very seriously, but the police told her not to worry. They also thought she was exaggerating or lying, but told her they were going to take her in that night for an evaluation. Not long after, Kari was told that Danielle would not be coming back to the residence. She had been admitted to a facility and was banned from school. A few months later, we were informed of the charges that were being laid against Danielle: animal cruelty, animal neglect, and possession of indecent images of underage minors. They'd found videos of her mutilating animals. With my own research, I found pages of her online discussing how she liked necrophilia, etc. She proudly boasted about all her fetishes and claimed online that she had ended lives before. It turns out she had indeed been in care because she had tried to end someone's life, and had been kept in confinement since she had been removed from school as she was considered a danger to staff and other residents. On res, her roommates had claimed that she was up all night and rarely left her room. They also reported a strange smell coming from it, and that she was a bit weird. In her room, the police also found a kit that she was preparing. They found written fantasies about breaking and entering, all kinds of sexual assault, including with a minor, and believed the kit was being prepared for when she would finally go and live out the fantasies. They also told Kari that they believed she admitted all of this to her within an hour of meeting her, because she had somehow thought she had found someone with similar interests and was looking to partner with her. Last I heard, she pleaded guilty, but her sentencing was postponed as they was doing further psychiatric evaluations on her. Fun times. I forgot to mention one thing, but get this, guys. She's a Romanian orphan. No joke. This happened just when I finished college. Me and my buddy lived way out in the sticks, a little village that no one's ever heard of, so I'm not going to bother mentioning it. There were always rumors that in the local woods, cult activity happened at night. We never bought it. It's the kind of thing that children say in middle school to scare each other, and will tell each other at camp that one time something happened, that they saw someone in a robe or something. I don't know. I never paid any heed to it. So anyway, my buddy and I are there one night, just talking and chatting, and one of us has the bright idea to go for a midnight walk. There was a beautiful path nearby that was always lit through the night, popular with cyclists during the day. It was a calm and tranquil kind of night, and we both, being bored, decided to light up a cigarette on our way and carry on our conversations, as neither of us were tired. It was quite late at night, already dark out, and as we started walking and chatting, an ominous and dark feeling overcame me. As you can imagine, I wasn't best pleased by this and looked around, looking for the culprit of such a sensation, but I found nothing. I decided to just be a bit more wary that night, and I didn't want to ruin the vibe. We carried on walking, and the conversations were flowing naturally. We were having a really good night. I was getting a bit tired, and knew that after our walk I would probably turn in and just pass out on his sofa. We're about halfway through this walk, when all of a sudden, he goes, "Shh, dude." I look around, don't see anything, and he puts his hand on my mouth and the other on the shoulder, and pushes me down to the ground. We slowly step back off the path, and he looks me dead in the eyes and gives me a look that says, "Stay quiet." I crouch behind a tree, really unsure what the hell's going on. That's when we see about 8 to 10 people on bikes. They're quite far away at this point, so I'm thinking it's quite silly that he's making us hide off the path for cyclists, as I said it was illuminated. These people were all wearing robes, and I don't mean like a bathrobe, I mean they were all wearing proper dark robes, black robes, like the robes you see characters in video games wearing. I thought this was all a joke, maybe something he'd set up elaborately. But they all go past. And you know what? They were acting perfectly normal. They were talking and just cycling, fairly chilly. I and my friend, after a minute or so that they'd passed, get up and ask him if that was some kind of prank. It seemed all a bit too, laid back. He tells me that he thought that the rumors from school were nothing but that, rumors, but that it's clear to see that there is something fishy going on. He says that we should follow them to see what they're up to. By this point, the adrenaline that had coursed through me had perked me up a little bit, and in our stupidity we decided to see if we could follow. Deep down I thought that they must have been going quite far if they were on bikes, but entertained the idea that my friend had. It was probably about a 4-minute walk when we found the bikes discarded by the side of the path. There was a small clearing up ahead and a little dirt path that the cultists had obviously walked upon. At this point I start getting chills. What if more arrive and we're caught in the middle of some cultist fiasco or something? I really didn't want to stick around for that. But my friend said that they were already doing something and to look up ahead. It was up a small hill. I could already smell fire, and we were hiding a little bit off the path, going up the trees, ever so slowly just to see what they were doing. When we reach the top, we're crouching behind trees, hidden in absolute darkness far off the path and their fire. We stare in curiosity at a bunch of people in robes dancing around the fire, and one guy right next to the fire chanting out of a book. It was literally like a scene taken directly from a movie. Part of me wanted to believe that there was someone filming and this could have been part of a student film, but they were all very keen in their activity. After a while, the chanting and dancing stops, and the guy in the middle starts speaking nonsense words that neither of us understand, but I would assume were probably Latin or something akin to that. At that point, my friend and I think it might be time to hightail it out of there. But just as we agree to that, do the cultists all of a sudden stop. In silence, they get into single file and start leaving, the fire dying down. The main man, as I'm going to refer to him as, says some words over the fire and proceeds after them in a straight line, almost like kids lining up at school. They each grab their bike and start cycling away, like nothing had ever happened. We're left, confused and dazed. We give it about half hour before we even make a move, just in case they stuck around. But when we were confident that they had finally left, do we go up to the embers of the fire and see if there's anything suspicious. And with that, we go home and call it a night. Nothing innately creepy or sinister happened, but I wonder what the hell they were doing and practicing, and more importantly, what would have happened to us, and if we'd have found ourselves on the same fire had they identified us, watching their little gathering. Who knows? This is a story which I took a while to find out about from my parents. My family consists of my mum, dad, big sister and I. We were on holiday at a big family-style resort in the 90s. For context, this happened somewhere in a South American country. I've told this story many times, but don't want to dox myself by giving away too many details. For context, I have no recollections of the event, but I do remember parts of the holiday. The sea, the white sand, and banana trees. The four of us were staying at one of those classic family hotels, the ones where the buffet have eggs, bacon, fresh fruits and pancakes galore. The type where there are also lots of kids and a lot of animation for them. There was a kids club where I would go, and I remember making a friend there too, a little boy my age. That's all I remember. And the rest is from my dad recounting this. We were at the hotel playing area, my parents and I. A woman working for the hotel and part of the kids' club animation team were playing with me. I was a cute, shy little blonde kid, and she started playing with me and talking to me. My parents relax, enjoying their holiday knowing that their daughter is being entertained by the kids' club staff. All good, until my dad turns around and sees that I am missing. I am not next to them, and the woman playing with me was also nowhere in sight. With Papa Bear reflexes, my dad stands up to see the woman is walking slowly but surely across the hotel with his daughter in her arms. He begins chasing her down the hotel, and she takes up some speed, beginning to run with me in her arms. This was a vast hotel complex, so there was a long way to go. My dad says he ran after her through doors which would then close in his face. By a stroke of luck, he managed to catch up with her just before she made it to the side exit and pulled me out of her hands. In shock, he grabbed me and ran back, letting the woman disappear into a forest. Immediately, my parents went to the hotel to complain and let them know that either their staff or somebody pretending to be their staff tried to take me. The hotel brushed this off casually and said, "Oh, don't worry about it. This happens sometimes." I hope this hotel has changed since the 90s, but it really makes me think how messed up is it that the hotel didn't give a single damn that someone was almost taken on their watch, and it's almost like they were in on it somehow. Last night I was in my kitchen alone, and just making myself something to eat around 3 a.m. or so, and I can feel something near or around me. While making myself a drink, I can see some sort of dark shadow quickly disappear around the wall, which has a little mirror cabinet in the corner, so I can see right around the wall, and of course, there's nothing there. At this point I can feel something tug at my shirt collar, and the hair on my neck stands up on edge. So I quickly finish making what I had meant to and get back to my room ASAP. I know for a fact that I'm the only person awake, as my sisters are asleep and my brother is out. My mum's at work, and my dad is asleep in his room, so any noises I heard outside were definitely not them. I've read a lot of stories, and at the time thought it might be my mind playing tricks on me. But at this point I know that something is causing me to feel uneasy about the kitchen, or at least that part of the house alone. So after a few minutes I went to put my plate away and basically received confirmation that there is something here. I have a weird paranoia about stuff, so I always check to see if my balcony door is closed and locked, and there is no excess stuff plugged into outlets, that the fan light in the living room is off. The only time I leave it on is when I'm not going to sleep or during the day, and that the sink isn't on in any way, and that the stove dials are all off. I turn them slowly to make sure they are in the off position, then last I checked to see if all the bolts and locks on the main door are locked. Just before I went into my room with the plate, I did all 5 and went to eat. After I came out, I felt that same feeling again, and quickly washed my plate and glass, but then I saw what confirmed it all. In the living room we have this little cabinet with boxes in it. The time it was filled, and the time it was put there was the only time it's been moved. This has not been moved at all since we put it in that spot. But as I walked back to my room I turned around and saw that it was sitting about a foot forward from the wall. Now, had anyone moved it forward to grab something that might have fallen behind it, they would have had to have put it back right away because my mum would get angry. To be honest, now that I think about it, you can't really drop anything behind the cabinet to begin with, as the entire cabinet is squared off and everything would be contained inside. But, as I'm moving back, I looked around to see if anyone was awake, but nope. I turned around to go through my 5 steps again, and the first thing I notice is that the balcony door is open slightly, with the latch. It's a little lever that when it's in the upward position, it will be unlocked, and then it swings downwards towards the side and points down, which is when it locks itself. It is in the halfway point directly 90 degrees pointing to the side. I've never seen anyone in the house doing this, as it would get in the way of opening the door itself due to the latch being in the way of the handle. This confirmed that something is there, but not an intruder. We are about 20 stories up, because I checked everything in the house and nothing. not even in the smallest places to hide. But something even more creepy happened the next morning. I had decided to go check the mail downstairs and got ready. As I stepped outside, the light right above my head started to flicker. I know, cheesy as hell, but I still got that uneasy feeling, so I knew it might not just be the bulb, which, by the way, wouldn't a bulb just go dimmer and then stop working rather than flicker? And my little attentiveness above me. I always look around and walk down the hall when I noticed that the stairwell door was fully shut. The apartment in front of mine and all the others along the hallway were also fully shut. I thought, now this is the perfect time to get a video of all of this. So I turned around and then started to record. There's no wind in the hallway, no doors that need to be closed, as it's on the other floors, and you can't hear what's going on the other floors either. These doors are pretty heavy, so no gust of wind or anything will slam them. It's 30 degrees C, humid, no wind at all unless you were outside. So after I got the mail, I started walking back down the hallway from the elevator, only to be met with the lights working perfectly. I had been gone for 3 minutes, or less, as I had a 3-minute song playing, and it barely finished by the time I came back up. No repairman is that good that he can figure out the light is out, get his ass up there with a ladder, take out the glass around the bulb, replace it, take the old bulb and ladder away, in the elevator which I was just in, within 3 minutes. I work as an engineer in a data center cooling plant. We're responsible for basically everything in the building, mechanical, electrical, HVAC, plumbing. So the engineer I'm relieving tells me there's an odd sound coming from the Con Ed vaults. This is where huge transformers are that step down the 26,000 volts or so to a voltage the building can actually use. We're not allowed in those vaults. They're locked and only Con Ed has the keys. So he leaves and I take a walk by the vaults. I had never actually heard electricity arcing through the air before, but I knew I was hearing it then. I called Con Ed's emergency line and told them to get out there ASAP. A crew of 2 guys showed up. They seemed calm and disinterested in the elevator all the way up. It's probably just a contact chattering, they said. We got off the elevator and they start heading down the hall. The sound was way louder now. We weren't even near the vaults and there was no mistaking it. Both guys stopped dead in their tracks and kind of hunkered down. I saw the color drain from them. I wasted no time getting back in the elevator. If you've never seen a video of a large transformer explosion, go to YouTube. These transformers are not like the ones you see up on utility poles. They're as big as a couple of trucks stacked on top of each other. Anyone on the floor, when one of them cooked off, would be gone. And we have 8 of them. Eventually, the con guys got in, but not before cutting the power to the entire building. They called in right away, cut the power, then a bunch of more Con Ed guys showed up to check out the damage. Apparently there's a conductor at the top of these transformer called a hammerhead. The insulation had burnt right off, and it just got worse from there. Everyone in the utility was glad we caught it when we did. I'm a 33-year-old female. As a 90s kid growing up in Eastern Europe, my childhood was full of stories, some of which cringeworthy, some hilarious, but still managed to give me chills, especially now that I fully realized the potential harm I was facing back then. I had several instances where I got pretty close to being in real danger, but here I've picked only the 2 most prominent ones, because I don't want to bore you with a long post, and because they are imprinted in my mind, and weirdly very vivid in every detail. I was 10 years old. It was a hot summer day in noon. I was allowed to play in front of my apartment building with other kids, but I had to always stare where my mum could peek from the window and see me. On this day, maybe because it was noon, and most of the other children were still having lunch or a nap, on the playground was just me and an 8-year-old boy, drawing with chalk on the ground. There weren't any people on the streets, but I remember noticing a man in his 20s walking past us. I didn't pay much attention to him at first, until I noticed that he started to stop and turned to look at us a few times. But then he went away, so I kept drawing. Some time passed, and I suddenly saw a pair of male shoes standing next to where I was crouched down. And when I looked up, I saw it was the same man. He looked around, and then asked the boy to go a little further away because he wanted to tell me a secret. The boy obliged, and I was left alone with this stranger. I remember he was staring at me. Even though he was smiling, there was some undercurrent tension in his whole demeanor, which made me feel a bit uneasy. He leaned down, propping his hands on his knees. I don't recall exactly what he said at first because I was looking around to see if anyone I knew was around. But then he asked me if I liked kittens. My eyes lit up, and I immediately perked, saying yes. And then he said he knew where a mother cat with her litter of kittens was, and asked if I wanted to go see them. I immediately stood up, my uneasiness and all this stranger danger warnings immediately dissolving at the prospect of kittens, as my mum didn't allow pets at home. He told me to follow him, and I did. Him walking in front of me and me behind, until I saw that he was actually going towards one of the 4 entrances of the apartment building. Back then, the front doors of those buildings weren't locked, and neither were the entrances to the basement area, which were on the inside next to the main door. He entered the building and started to descend down the staircase leading to the basement area, and that's when some form of self-preservation instinct started to kick in and made me hesitate at the doorstep. He was already on the last step down to the basement when he turned to check if I was following, and beckoned me in a cheerful, "Come on, hurry up." I took a few more hesitant steps in, and he continued further into the basement corridor where it was dark, humid, and a putrid smell of mold lingered. I could see half of him. The rest of him was hidden behind the corner of the wall, but then I heard a metal click sound. I was starting to descend down the steps. I know, I cringe at my own stupidity when I remember it too. When he peeked again, half of him was still hidden from sight, but the visible half revealed his belt buckle dangling unbuckled, and then he came out a little more and his hand moved, drawing my eyes down when I saw it. Yeah, you guessed it, his pants were unzipped, and he looked at me and I still remember the expression in his eyes. I wanted to scream, but I was honestly so shocked. I had a deer in the headlights moment, and before he took a step up towards me, I finally felt the sudden adrenaline rush kicking in. One moment I was standing frozen, the next I was running out of there at the speed of light. I didn't even turn to see if he was following. All I knew was that I had to get away. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, to which there were 2 entrances from this one, just in time to bump into every worried mum who was putting her shoes on to get out to look for me. Worried sick because apparently the last time she peeked through the window, she didn't see me, and shouted my name a few times and got no answer. She had an unsettling feeling that something was wrong. She asked me what happened, and at first I didn't tell her because I was shamed and scared that she would get even angrier if she found out I was even talking to a stranger, let alone about to follow him. I started feeling anxious after that, and eventually admitted to what happened to my mum. Needless to say, I was given an earful of lectures, but wasn't allowed to play outside without supervision until years later. The second prominent story took place when I was 12. And thinking back now, compared to today's 12-year-olds being so outspoken and street smart, I was still a clueless kid. I remember I was feeling very insecure and self-conscious at the time, because puberty had hit as if overnight, and my previous scrawny little body was beginning to form curves, which also prompted unwanted attention from teenage boys, and even older men, at the age of my father, taking notice of me when I walked past them. It was during the spring vacation when my mum, my aunt, and my 13-year-old male cousin and I went to the amusement park in my city. My cousin was riding a bumper car, and I was sitting on a bench with my mum and aunt, when I spotted a man setting a big tin pot at the alley leading to the park. I immediately started pleading with my mum to give me money, because I knew what he was selling: boiled corn on the cob. Now keep in mind that back then nobody seemed to care about checking health and sanitary permissions of street vendors, and it was very common to see little ice cream stands and old ladies sitting on chairs with a pot next to them, selling boiled corn on the cob or cotton candy. My mum sent me to buy 4 of them, 1 for each of us, and I headed towards the man, my mouth already watering. When I approached him and ordered, however, I noticed that he hesitated and gave me a very unsettling once-over from head to toe, and then, without even opening the pot to check, declared there won't be enough corn in there. I thought that was weird, considering I had just spotted him coming, which logically was supposed to mean he had a pot full of corn, but didn't say anything because I was shy and awkward, and it had never even occurred to me to question an adult like that, especially a stranger. He quickly added that his car was parked at the nearby parking lot, which was right behind the alley leading to the amusement park, and told me that if I wanted it, I should follow him to retrieve another spare pot from his trunk. I looked back at the park and thought that the parking lot was still close enough and shouldn't be a problem. So relieved that I will, after all, get my corn, I followed him. He picked the pot and started carrying it towards the car, with me walking a few steps behind, and he was just opening the trunk to put the pot inside when 2 things happened spontaneously. My hand was abruptly grabbed by my aunt, who shook me and started questioning my sanity for walking away with a stranger, and shouting at the man for being crazy to suggest to a child to follow them to the car, and I caught a glimpse of the trunk, and inside was no other pot of corn, but the one he just put inside. Now at that point I was still confused, and frankly I'm ashamed to admit I was even a little annoyed at my aunt for overreacting, because I still wanted my corn and didn't understand what the big deal was until my train of thought was interrupted. What happened next still makes the hairs on my neck stand on end. Instead of clarifying the situation, given any semi-reasonable explanation or attempting to respond in any way, the man suddenly rushed to close the trunk, ran to his car, and then took off in such a hurry that the tires made those screeching noises from the rapid acceleration. My aunt and I stood there dumbfounded, and it suddenly dawned on us that what appeared to be an innocent yet cautionary situation was actually a very real potential taking attempt, because if there had ever been any reasonable doubt before as to why the man would lure a 12-year-old girl alone towards his car, his following reaction of fleeing the scene had left no room for it. My aunt visited us recently, and that instance was brought up somehow, so she said that she still remembers how what drew her attention at first was the fact that the man was unusually dressed up for a street vendor, and so she was watching closely with a weird gut feeling at first. When she saw that he was taking me towards the parking lot, she sprinted into action. Thank God my aunt, being a PE teacher and a mother of a very wild boy, was wearing sneakers and was always prepared to jump into action. I was on a date in Camden with a girl who, from photos, I wasn't overly excited about meeting, but in the flesh made my eyebrows shoot off my head. She was really pretty and smart and funny. We had quite a few cocktails, and I think we were in the Blues Kitchen before going to the gay bar in Camden, which I think has since closed down. I think it was called the Black Cap. The date was going well, and we met these people who join our table, and the guy tells me at the bar that my date said she wanted me to kiss her. I did, and it turned out the guy was just helping us by moving things along. My date was really shocked, and told me I was bold, but she liked it. She came back to my hotel room with me, which was a 10-minute walk away. The room was kind of small but cool, and space age in style. We were both drunk and made out a lot. Then she started crying about problems she was having with a friend, who was really sick, and her job was really stressful. Full-on sobbing. She left in embarrassment, even though I was worried about her leaving like that. She said she would be okay. As she left, I saw a large man in a black, thick leather jacket in the corridor. He was staring at my date as she left, and then stared at me as I closed the door. I was pretty wasted, so after checking my date got on the bus, I had a nap and was awoken by a banging at the door. I ignored it, but then it kept going on, so I got up and staggered to the door and opened it a crack. I recognized the leather elbow and arm as the door was shoved violently open. I was drunk, and the jolt of the door caused me to fall over. Luckily, the room entrance was small and around the width of the door, so my back was against the wall by the door while my feet touched the other wall. My body kept the door closed as this man kept shoving against it. I managed to get the door closed again, blocked it and went to sleep as I was still drunk. When I woke up in the morning, I thought I had dreamt the whole thing about the man and the door. But when I looked down at my side, my ribs, hips and thigh had dark bruises. I was really lucky, and I'm so glad the room was tight on space, because if it hadn't been, the guy would have got in pretty easily. So creepy leather-clad man who tried to break into my hotel room, let's not meet. I just want to add I'm female, of average height, average body weight, and have really beady arms. In the summer of 2015, my husband and I were house sitting for these rich people in between our big move to the mainland, as we're from Hawaii, and some really crazy creepy stuff started happening just a few days in. The first weird thing that happened was when we got there I couldn't find how to get the motion sensor light in the entry garage hallway to turn off. We thought nothing of it. A few days later I was watching TV, and you can see the front door from the living room, and I saw a shadowy man walk by the front door. I wasn't particularly freaked out, because unfortunately shadow people are frequent visitors of mine. I think it must have been a Hawaii thing because everyone has seen them there. I think it must have been that same evening that I hadn't seen my husband for several minutes. So I called out to him and saw that front motion detector light flip on again right at that moment. So I walked out to it and heard him go, "What?" from the backyard, not the front yard. I quickly walked to the backyard through the house, and staring back towards the front yard, I saw an orb zoom out the house and into the yard. A side note on orbs, I've watched those paranormal shows on Discovery Channel, but never thought they were real until I actually saw them. Anyway, fast forward a few days, a different motion detecting light started going crazy one night, flipping on and off in varying intervals. At this point, my husband, who you might call the rational one, is totally freaked out. I, however, felt extremely curious and wanted to investigate, which is so weird for me because I'm a total scaredy cat. I even make my husband walk me to the bathroom in the middle of the night because I'm too scared to go by myself. But I just felt compelled to go towards the garage upstairs area, and there's an apartment above the garage, and figure out what's going on. We got a flashlight and shined it into the garage and apartment windows, and we couldn't help feeling this very, very weird dread and fear emanating from it. Even though I was curious, I also felt it in the pit of my stomach, like some overwhelming depression or evil. We called it quits, I locked the doors, and we went to bed after that. There were several other things that we encountered while we were staying there. One evening I heard someone say, "Ding dong," kind of like how someone would say when they get to a friend's house to inform them of their presence, after which the dogs, as we were also dog-sitting, went nuts barking at the front door, although there was no one there. One night when we were walking into the bedroom, something brushed up against my arm, and when I turned I saw a person walking the other way down the hallway, turning a corner. Myself and one of the dogs saw an orb fly out of a room we were in. The dog definitely saw it too, and he looked freaked out. One morning while showering I dropped my razor on the ground, and when I bent down to pick it up, it was on the countertop across the bathroom. One morning my husband dropped his toothbrush and he couldn't find it for an hour, and then it reappeared on the countertop. I've had a lot of ghostly paranormal encounters in my life, but this last summer just puts it over the top. At one point I was in tears asking my husband why I'm so perceptive and why these things keep happening to me. There's a small island called Ilha de Queimada Grande off the coast of Sao Paulo, Brazil, that is home to the highest concentration of golden lancehead vipers. one of the most venomous species of snake in the world. They are unique to this island alone, and its venom causes your flesh to rot off to your bones. The island is so densely packed with these snakes that there are up to 5 snakes per square meter on this island. You could stand anywhere on the island and be no more than a few feet away from a golden lancehead viper. Apparently there was only a lighthouse keeper who lived on the island with his family, but they didn't survive long. After a while, snakes crawled through their windows. Panicking, they ran outside into the forest where they were confronted by thousands of snakes, and were bitten numerous times running through the forest, hanging overhead by branches. They all died before they could reach their boat, and their bodies were found scattered through the forest later by a navy vessel making a routine supply stop. There was also an attempt to build a banana plantation on the island, but that quickly ended in disaster, as all the workers were dying from the vipers. The island is forbidden to civilians by the Brazilian Navy. I'm in the Navy and work on an aircraft carrier. A girl sadly ended her life in one of the spaces right near where me and my shop slept. One person swore he saw her sitting in the chair as he was getting undressed one day and ran screaming out of the berthing. I waited about a week to go into the space where she ended her life, and when I did, I heard the loudest screeching noise I'd ever heard in my life. I quickly turned around and got the hell out of there. The system connected to where she slept didn't work at all for the next 2 weeks. The system breaks a lot, so it was pretty coincidental that it happened just as she did this. I used to work at a dessert stand in a local mall. It was one of those cute little single worker booths, meaning most of what I had to do was interact with customers and learn how to use a cash register. When I first began working the job, standing for abnormally long shifts as there was no chairs in the booth and having so much to memorize was exhausting. Not to mention getting back late, having loads of homework to do. Thanks, high school. It didn't help. I assumed that things weren't going to get much worse since my manager told me it was easy to get the hang of, but boy was I wrong. Generally, people in the mall are polite and communicative, but inevitably you run into some weirdos or entitled people at times, especially in a service job. I was perfectly aware of that, and you sort of get used to the customer patterns as you work. So those people were not much of an inconvenience to interact with. However, just for a bit of context, I'm super awkward, an extra memey type of person who uses humor in bad situations and also has anxiety, which isn't good for social interactions, which means dealing with rather unusual people is a struggle. Oh, I'm feeling lethargic at the same time, because a bit of stuttering and slows my reaction as well. The story. When I had just finished training for this job, there was a presumably middle-aged man who approached the booth. I brightly greeted him, thinking he'd ask questions about desserts. Instead, he mutters something along the lines of, "You're very sweet, you're good," and walks off, assuming that since his English clearly wasn't his first language, he was referring to the food. I ignored it, but I did get this odd feeling about him. With my forced grin and a confused, "Thanks?" he left. My manager, who was working in the nearby food court seats, happened to catch a glimpse of this. She made eye contact with me, clearly uncomfortable, and asked if everything was okay, but I shrugged it off. A few minutes later, he abruptly trotted up again. This time he made wide gestures with his lanky arms while grumbling. "You're lucky to be here. I'm attracted to you, but I'm old. If I wasn't 71 and I was your age, I would date you. Tell your friends and boyfriends that." And then went off in an incomprehensible tangent about my appearance before slinking off again. My tired mind wasn't exactly registering what just happened, so I just stared into the small distance of the mall, spooked to the max. I guess I was frowning pretty profusely since my manager became concerned and quickly slid behind the counter to firmly ask if I was fine, to which I replied there was a slight creepy man who already approached me twice. I told her that it wasn't a big deal, but she knew that I was just trying to dismiss the threat and insisted on staying. She planted herself beside me and we both shared an unsaid feeling that something more was going to happen. Bingo. A few minutes passed before he rushed up to the counter again. He began trying to restate what he was saying earlier through a crooked smile, revealing a row of yellow teeth. He was leaning over the counter as far as he possibly could, and his beady eyes were fixated on my grimace. Startled by his audacity, my manager brusquely hissed, "Can I help you?" To which he moistly breathed, "Oh no, I just wanted to talk to her." Never once did he break eye contact. He continued to tell me how my complexion was very good, and that I should tell all my friends and boyfriends that. He went off about how my looks would be good for sale. His speech was very repetitive and just plain off-putting. At this point, my manager and I were both thinking that the dude is clearly not in his right mind on multiple levels, and we might need to call some extra help. Also, bro, I'm ugly as hell, so you must be crazy thinking otherwise. He did end up leaving pretty quickly after that, but I can't imagine what else he had planned doing if my manager hadn't been there. I guess her presence did end up scaring him off since he didn't return that night. Although scared for the rest of the shift, I tried to work through it, deciding that I simply came across a rare occasion and was thankful that I didn't have a stalker or something worse. I thought I was just unlucky that one time. After that incident, I put the Morse security number in my contacts, not expecting to have to use it just in case. Well, next week comes by. I came back and started my shift early, and immediately while scanning the possible customers I spotted the same guy just a seat several yards away, eyes closed. He was facing the booth, and it appeared as though he were waiting for something. He was stationary for 20 minutes before suddenly rising and patrolling the area. I ducked behind the boxes on the counter, and by some miracle the man didn't see me and exited the building. Thankfully I haven't seen him since. The idea that he regularly comes to the mall truly is sickening. The idea that he was likely coming back to that area, as the same time he was there the first time, just to be a creep again is even more disgusting. This was around 2007-2008. I was about 12 at the time, and me and my dad were heading up to Cape York. It was a good few days' drive to Cairns from where we lived in Bundaberg, Queensland, and we were in no rush. We finally got into Cairns at around 10:30 p.m. We were both really excited to cross the Daintree River and really start the adventure. It was decided that we would hang out at my uncle's place for a few days, as we didn't see him often. My uncle is a dead-set straight out of the 70s, Lennon glasses wearing pot-smoking hippie musician guys. He also loved fishing, and his favourite place to go was the Daintree. Anyway, the morning rolls around and we head out to launch the boat at around 6 a.m. and fish away for most of the day. Didn't catch anything, but we were kept entertained by my uncle telling us all his stories. As the sun is beginning to set, we head over this little spit of white sand way over the side of the river. My uncle was dead set that he could find his way back in the dark, so we hung about on the little private beach talking, drinking and cooking a lamb roast in the campfire oven. Now for those of you who don't know, the Daintree has a bit of a lizard problem. And when I say lizards, I mean huge ass crocodiles that will mess you up 8 ways to Sunday. My uncle is adamant that they don't come this far out, as the water starts getting a bit cold for them, so we aren't too worried. So as we're sitting there, we notice that my uncle isn't doing much talking, he's just kind of sitting and listening. We ask him what's up, and he sort of motions us to shut up. We don't really hear much at all, but he's got the both of us pretty spooked. All of a sudden he jumps up and runs as fast as you'd please to the tinny and grabs this big long bamboo spear thing. One of us had to ask him earlier in the day what it was for, and he said he keeps it around in case crocs got too close. He could give them a jab from the boat and they'd swim away and leave him be. Well, he takes a few steps off into the dark, jabs into this patch of mangroves with this long-ass bamboo pokey stick, and me and my dad just about died when we hear this big scaly thing take off into the water at 50 miles an hour. We noped out of there without finishing our roast. Chills my blood to know that thing was a few feet away from us while we were having a good time. If any of us would have walked off in that direction for a slash, we'd have been chomped for sure. As of today, I'm a 28-year-old female. But growing up, I was a very sensitive little boy. My parents adopted me as a baby, and I never met my birth family until 2012. It was then I learned that every woman in my birth family were all quite sensitive to the paranormal. Nobody in my adoptive family had any sort of sensitivity, but they all did things subconsciously. When I was 9, my family moved to a very nice house in St. Helena, Napa, overlooking the valley. It was a beautiful 2-story house, but in a weird way since it was on a hill. From the road, the second story was the first, but from the backyard down the mountain, both floors were visible. I believed it was called a sloped lot. Upstairs were the garage, linked to the main house by a breezeway leading to the laundry room. To the right was the study, and straight ahead was a living room and a kitchen. The hallway ran parallel to the kitchen, meeting at a family/dining room, where the front door sat, though none of us actually used it. Right next to that were the stairs, the dreaded stairs, leading down to one long hallway connecting the bedrooms. The experiences began happening immediately after we moved in. Part of me believes it was drawn to the negative trauma I suffered at the hands of my abusive father, who focused his rage mostly on me. And that's why I was targeted out of my brothers. But that's just a theory. The first of my many experiences was when the whole family was at my middle school for a scholastic book fair. I remember having a sudden twisting in my gut when my parents got a call that our backyard was on fire. To this day, nobody knows how it happened. It just started. Then the real fun began. It started out slowly, and only ever happened downstairs. My brothers and I would wake up and see a man walking back and forth on the patio, glancing through the French doors of our bedrooms as he passed. We never felt malice from him, and we all recalled seeing him. What makes that particular bit interesting is that from a child's perspective, usually the male entity would be malicious, while the female entity could be a protector. In my house, it was the polar opposite. Myself and my brothers felt a dark presence lurking downstairs in the hallway that would affect all 3 of us, to the point where we would take the stairs 2 or 3 at a time as fast as possible. I would have a recurring nightmare about struggling to get to the top of the stairs when something caught behind me. In one particular dream, I was reaching for the top stair, and the entity caught me and strapped my mouth shut so I couldn't scream. Keep in mind, I was too young for these things to naturally come to me. In the beginning, the door to my bedroom would slam in the wee hours of the morning, so loudly it would wake my father. He insisted it was a draft, even though no one else's doors would do it, and again it slammed with a massive force. We had to put a 10-pound bookend in front of it. Not much later, the entity in the hall would probe our bedrooms to see who was the most sensitive. My older brother, who slept at the end of the hall, nearest the darkness, outgrew his empathetic sensitivity. And my younger brother eventually stopped as well. But I remained more sensitive than ever, and I knew it. And that's when I met her. When the entity first introduced itself, I felt like it was kind of a protector, like the man from the balcony. But I knew that it wasn't true. She would stand at the far end of the hallway and wait. Not that she was actually there. There was no one there. But it was more of a feeling of perpetual dread. It wasn't darkness or blackness, but more that it physically sucked the light in around it like a dark hole. She would come to me in dreams as various entities, but the man would always show up and protect me. Mind you, I neither knew her nor the man, and the fact that the house was built on an inactive volcano littered with limestone and obsidian probably boosted the energy or what have you. For about 7 years, I would wake up promptly at 3 a.m. sweating bullets, hearing someone running back and forth in the hallway, panting as they passed my room, repeatedly until around 5 a.m. when it began to get light. The first face-to-face incident with this creature was when I woke up at scheduled at 3 a.m. like clockwork and heard the panting and pacing in the hallway. After about 20 minutes, I got too scared to sit there and do nothing, and reached to the dresser by my bed and turned on the light. The panting and pacing stopped, and I waited about 10 seconds of soul-crippling silence before it happened. Long, gnarly, shadowy fingers slowly gripped the doorframe one by one. I heard the wood of the frame creak slightly as the wispy fingers pulled into the bedroom. Before my brain could process what I was seeing, I heard her gasp, like an audible gasp. The fingers retreated in pain, and I sat in silence until the sun came up 2 hours later. That was the first time I realized I had a weapon against this thing. I still don't fully understand it, but she couldn't exist in light. While that alone brought tears to my eyes recalling it, there was one other experience that haunts me to this day. Plenty of years had gone by now, and I had turned 14. My father was a prominent doctor in the area, and he was planning on taking my mother to a fancy hospital gala the same night my little brother had a sleepover at a friend's house, and my older brother was out college shopping in some other county. It was the first time I had the house to myself at night. I begged them to reschedule or hired me a babysitter. They told me I was old enough to be a babysitter and that I needed to grow up. Everyone in my family, them included, experienced weird happenings, but they all preferred to turn a blind eye. So my pleas fell on deaf ears and I was left alone. I spent the first half of the evening upstairs where it was safe, occasionally glancing towards the staircase for any activity from the living room while the TV distracted me. About 10 or 11 p.m., I remember thinking that I was too old to be scared to be by myself, and I could sleep downstairs alone if I wanted to. I kept the lights on upstairs and slowly descended the staircase, feeling the darkness getting closer with every step. When I reached the last step, I leaped to the light switch and hit it, illuminating the hallway, shaking violently. I hurried to my bedroom. Through the eerie quiet, my footsteps on the carpet were the only sound to break the silence. I finally slunk into my bedroom and quickly turned on the dresser light, jumping into bed as I stared into the lights shining through the downstairs. Going over in my head that all the doors were locked, all the windows were closed, and that as long as these lights were on I was safe, the lassitude of Morpheus overcame me, and my mind began to wander into the fields of Nod. Unlike the usual times I woke up at night, this time was slightly different. I woke up suddenly completely alert, with the fight or flight response already kicking in. I was facing the wall, but was absolutely terrified. I felt like if I moved or even breathed too loudly, it would spell immediate death. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was most likely only a few minutes, before I mustered up the courage to roll over. When I did, my heart sunk. All the lights in the house were off, and a womanly shadow was standing in the doorway, and thought that maybe my mother had popped her head in, before I realized she was with my father at the gala all night, and they were staying in a hotel until morning. I just sat there frozen, locked in gaze with this creature who finally made it through the threshold of my doorframe and into my room, a feat she had yet to accomplish. I closed my eyes and repeated in my head that it isn't real. It isn't real. I was trying to control my breathing as I shake and shiver violently, and I decide to peek and see if she's still there. Surely she can't come in further. I open my eyes. It's standing right over me, at the edge of my bed looking down at me. Not with its eyes. It didn't have eyes. What it did have was a large, toothy grin amidst the wispy shadows of its body. I daredn't scream and even move, but hold the gaze as I heard a deep rumble emanating from the swirling torrent of darkness that was this creature. Having grown up terribly abused, I knew fear, but this was something else. I had never been this afraid before in my life. It was no longer creaks or shadows darting in the corner of your eye. It was face to face with me. Something else, something not of this world. And it wanted me. I knew in this moment as if its mouth began to expand, that if I did nothing I would die. So I did the only thing I could think of in that moment. My body suddenly lurched upwards from the bed towards the entity, and I screamed at it. Not a scream of fear, but more like a war cry. Like it could try to kill me, but I wasn't planning on making it easy. My face almost went through it, as it lurched up before it recoiled and let out an unearthly wail. As it heard my cry, it left the room. Within moments, all the lights in the house were back on, and I just sat there shivering in shock until the dam broke and I began to cry. I just cradled my pillow and rocked back and forth on the bed, sobbing until the sun came up and my parents returned home. My family, devout Catholic doctors, were already skeptical of these things and didn't believe me, attempting to convince me it was a night terror or perhaps sleep paralysis. Only I could move. I could think. I wasn't stuck. And it actually happened. I know I didn't dream it because I stayed awake until the next day. I don't expect anyone to believe me. But this was just the kind of thing that happened in this house. I believe it was limited to that specific location because it didn't follow me to college or anywhere else beyond. I fear for those who moved in when my parents sold it, but it would be cool to get in touch with who lives there and ask if they've experienced similar things. And we did have trouble selling it. It was on the market for years. Anytime someone would come to view it, they would get creeped out and leave. Anyway, that's my story. I personally don't believe in demons or anything gaudy, but I'll respect you if you do. If you have any theories on what it could have been, feel free to comment. I'm not one to ever pass up an opportunity for a good deal on some high-grade cannabis. So when I received a text from a friend of mine telling me that he could sell me a quarter of an ounce of some good stuff for $25, I jumped at the chance. He led me on all day telling me that he would be dropping it off in the evening. Evening came, and so did the text saying he'd drop by later that night. And finally at 11:30, I received a text sent with a ping of anxiety running through me. "Sup man, I'm headed out of town for the night. Your sack is in the garage under the ladder." I knew exactly what this entailed. I was to walk the 5 blocks to his old residence, a mutual friend's home where he lived in a loft in the garage. Slip in unnoticed by the neighbors, search until I found it, leave the money and be on my merry way. Simple, right? Wrong. The walk started off sketchy enough, with the lone street light on the block going out as I left, plunging me into this unusual pseudo-darkness. I walked along in silence, the only sound coming from the highway some distance away. I'd walked this way before, even at this hour, but I couldn't shake the anticipation in my gut. I reached the house, which I must say is absolutely terrifying at night. Something didn't seem right. My friend is very strict with his bedtimes. This meant that the house was dark at exactly 10 p.m. every night. Tonight, though, there was a glow coming from the first door. This could have been a number of things. Maybe he had other friends over, brought a girl home, or getting a late-night snack. I quickly assured myself as I stepped through the door into a pitch-black garage. I closed the door behind me and got to searching. The garage is separated into an upstairs and downstairs to save space. Upstairs there is a washer and dryer, while downstairs was a box storage that led under the stairs, forming a cave-like lair. I'm not gonna lie, I felt like a robbery simulator, rummaging through my friend's garage unannounced, looking for drugs. My heart began to race at the thought. It really started racing though, when I heard the heavy footsteps stomping their way towards the inside garage. I had kicked a paint can by accident, and they probably heard it. Now my first instinct told me that I should make myself known. It was my friend's place after all. He probably even knew about the whole deal. We laugh. He'd point where it was, and I'd be on my merry way. That's when I realized something. My friend does not own a single pair of boots. In a split instant, I had ducked down under the floorboards behind some boxes. The door outside was quite far away, the footsteps quickly approaching, so escape was not an option. I had to hide. I was so confused. It felt like I was in a slasher movie, hand over my mouth to keep from hyperventilating and everything. I listened as the door slammed open, the footsteps creaking slowly along the floorboards just inches to my right. They paced around the garage for what seemed like ages, grunting and taking heavy, labored breaths. They stopped at the top of the stairs, never making their way down though. Soon enough, they made their way back to the house, slamming on the door behind them. As soon as the door clicked, I bolted. I didn't stop running until I was back home, tucked away in my bed, every single light in the house on for the rest of the night. I wasn't about to get the cops involved with the situation, lest they go searching and get my friend in trouble. So I simply sent him a text message and went to sleep. I awoke to 2 texts in the morning. The first was a message from my dealer friend asking if I was alright. The second was a text from the friend who owned the house, telling me he got stuck at a friend's house overnight. I was so confused. Later that day, the friend with the house sent me a news link over Facebook with no caption. It was a news report about a burglary/murder that took place on my friend's street. 2 houses had already been confirmed as being broken into in the middle of the night. The first was the home of an injured veteran. He was found in his bedroom with a 9mm slug lodged in his head. All the valuables in his house gone. The second was my friend's house. When I was about 8 or 9, my family took a trip skiing to a small resort a few hours from where we lived in Spain. The resort itself was a sleepy town of about 400 to 500 people, with a few small supermarkets and hotels and not much else. Typically, we picked the worst time possible to embark on the trip, which had been planned for a good few years. The night after we arrived, there was a blizzard, and we spent the first half of the week locked in the hotel. Although we were able to go outside for the remaining few days, we had little to do given that the slopes were shut. The story I want to tell comes from those first few days locked in the hotel. Despite my parents' annoyance at the time of the trip being a nightmare, myself and my sister, who was 11 months older, had a fantastic time. Locked up in the mountains with nothing to do, we were able to spend our days running around the hotel, eating sweets and watching TV in the lobby. I should probably mention at this point that the hotel is somewhat of a maze. The large bar/restaurant area where my parents sat each day, reading, was at the center of the hotel. A myriad of smaller rooms then connected to the bar area at random points, shooting off in different directions. These rooms often had no discernible functions. Each one had the same mahogany interior, and they were full of couches, fireplaces, and antiques that allowed for a great game of hide and seek. The room would often have offshoots themselves, connecting to new rooms which would be then connected to yet more useful wooden caves. As such, it was possible to be 4 or 5 rooms away from the main hotel area at any time, without knowing exactly where you were or how to get back. Anyway, at some point along the weekend, myself and my sister decided to play hide and seek. Bearing in mind the above, it was almost an impossible challenge to find the hider, especially if they moved. To this day, I'm certain my sister was a filthy little cheat. At one point in the game, I was about to give up on searching for her until I heard her voice from what sounded like a few rooms away. After successfully navigating the web of rooms, I emerged to find her sitting on a couch alongside a German man with grey hair, probably in his 60s if I had to guess. As soon as I emerged into the room, the man turned to me and told me he was talking to my sister and taking her to the swimming pool, and asked if I wanted to join them. I remember immediately thinking it's odd that there was a swimming pool that we hadn't heard of. My parents had been complaining that morning about how much TV we were watching, and so I was sure they would have taken us there had they known about it. And besides, the hotel did not seem this size to be able to host one. I told the man that I'd have to ask my parents first, and told my sister to come back with me to find them. He immediately replied that I should go, and that he'll take my sister on ahead. I told my sister she absolutely had to come with me, But excited at the thought of the swimming pool, she said she didn't want to go. We began to argue with the man taking my sister's side and encouraging me to go ask my parents' permission while he waited with my sister. I dug my foot in, telling my sister that our parents would be very cross if we went somewhere on our own, and after a few minutes of bickering she eventually gave in and came back with me, giving her assurance to the man that we'd be back. Of course, when we told our parents, they were livid. My dad went back to the room to try and find the man, but with all the offshoots and given that all the random rooms looked the same, it was almost impossible to be sure we were in the right one. In any case, there was no sign of him. I remember my dad screaming at the clerk at the hotel lobby that he needed a list of names of all male guests and their room numbers, but of course they wouldn't give it to him. We spent the rest of the trip by our parents' side, terrified of the thought of being locked up in a blizzard with him. Thankfully, we never saw the man again. The scary thing, we checked with the lobby, and as we'd imagined, the hotel didn't have a pool. So scary German man who wanted to take me in a blizzard? Let's not meet again. In basic training, there is a mock deployment for the Air Force called Beast Week. Basic is in Texas, and it's hot as hell. During this Beast Week, we go through basic deployment stuff, and live, kind of like we're deployed. So we have, I think, 10 very large tents in a circle, with a bunker in the middle surrounded by mostly desert. Every night there's 2 people on shift doing security for every tent. So as we're sitting there in the boring ass dark, looking at stars and talking about nonsense, we hear a very faint help. But this wasn't a normal cry for help. This was the creepiest cry for help you've ever heard. So me and my other entry controller buddy are freaking out, and we look at each other, and I tell him to wait here and I'll check to see if the other ECs have heard anything. The 2 left of us said that they did hear something. One of them kind of recognized it as help, and the one further down on the left thought it sounded like an animal noise. I went to every tent that night and asked them to do a head count. We're all accounted for, and one of the other ECs was freaked out enough that they decided, you know what, let's tell Central Quarters. 20 minutes later, I'm getting my ass handed to me because I didn't report it immediately. I did, however, try to explain that we thought it was an animal because it was not a normal sounding help, and that everyone had heard it was freaked out. It freaked me out pretty well. Not sure what it could have been. My dad passed away in a motorcycle accident about 10 years ago. And after he passed, weird stuff started happening at the dorm when I got back. The clock would fall off the wall and change time. Batteries would separate themselves from remotes, and bangs and knocks were regular. But the weirdest thing that would happen was when I was coming home from college and took a shower, got dressed, and headed back into the bathroom to finish getting ready. And the mirror was just clearing the steam off, and lo and behold, I see smear marks faintly that looked like letters. So I tip the mirror because it's one of those triple pane medicine cabinet mirrors, and I see "Hey" spelled out in his handwriting with the elven eye symbol from Lord of the Rings that my dad would put everywhere. This was probably 6 months plus after he passed, and I have no idea where it came from since it was only me and my mum in the house, and I knew she wouldn't do that. The crazy part is like a week before that, I had broke open a glow stick and splashed it on the mirror, but the writing was under the splashes, and none was smeared or touched. Still to this day I can't explain how that happened. We actually took the entire mirror off the wall so it wasn't ruined. Quite a number of years ago, on my first trip to Africa, I was staying in a group campground in the Serengeti. The camp had quite a number of tents and was approved by the park management and was allotted one ranger with an AK-47 that looked like it was from the 70s. He patrolled around at night, but the camp had no barrier and he couldn't be everywhere. I was on my way back to my tent after playing cards into the night with those old crappy headlamps, which I had pointed to the ground. The camp was mostly empty, and my tent was at the farther end of where people were staying. I was watching my step as I looked, and the wash from my headlamp gives off enough light for me to see two pairs of eyes, one amber and one blue, stare back at me from about 20 feet away in the dark. I can't see what it is, they're just staring at me. Not small eyes either, probably about 2 or so feet off the ground. There's a point where you're so absolutely terrified your entire being goes into overdrive. Fight or flight doesn't ever happen. You can't feel anything, your body continues to work on its own accord, but all your mental capacity is focused on what's right in front of you. No adrenaline, almost like an out-of-body experience. I'm completely unaware of it, but I continue to walk, and since I don't show any change of behavior, the eyes turn off me and walk away. I go into my tent as calm as can be, just in complete shock, climb into bed, and wake up the next morning, bring the ranger over and find the tracks. Those eyes belong to 2 spotted hyena pack hunters, on par with lions. I've had other encounters in Africa over the years, but that's been the only time I've ever been alone in the presence of a superior number of predators without any kind of weapon to defend myself, especially at night. I'll just start this off by saying that my dad is a character. All of my friends loved him growing up because he could entertain you just by talking to him. This attitude is what initially led me to question the legitimacy of this story for a long time. But now that I'm a bit older, I could tell this one cuts deep every time we make him tell it. Usually he talks in a very upbeat, active tone, but when my brothers and I first heard him tell this story, or talk about it in general, his tone completely changes. It's as if all the color just rushes from his face. It's obvious he doesn't enjoy talking about it. Okay, now to the story. He was about 18 at the time. From pictures he seemed like an athletic, approachable teen who was living in the Gary/Whitting area of northwest Indiana. Sometime late in the evening, my dad, who's been a smoker for roughly 50 years of his life, decides to hitchhike to his local convenience store. He has a knack for talking about places or events as if he were there, an odd thing to do considering the shop was only a couple of miles away from his house. Eventually a truck pulls to the side of the road. It was a baby blue pickup truck to be exact. Apparently there were 2 men in the truck, probably both in their 40s or so. Pretty normal looking to him. He said that the driver was a bit burly and sort of looked like Jackie Gleason. The truck was only a 3-seater, so the man in the passenger side had to move to the middle. No words spoken apart from the driver asking him where he was going. This didn't strike my father as odd, so he proceeded to sit in silence, not suspecting anything. Suddenly, out of nowhere, one of the guys randomly bursts into laughter. According to my father, this wasn't your ordinary laugh, but something much more diabolical. Sure enough, the driver looks at my father with what he claims was the devil's eyes, now chiming in with the laughter. As you could suspect, they start going a different route. My dad knew they weren't heading anywhere near the desired location. He was trying to play it cool, waiting for his chance. Luckily, a few minutes later, they finally hit a red light. The driver slowly crept his arm across the cab and starts caressing my dad's neck. I guess his fight or flight kicked in, and a surge of adrenaline came about. He unlocked the door and bolted out, not looking back. He said he hid near a local church and watched as they drove around for him. Some years later, my dad was watching the news when the mugshot of the man popped onto the screen. His heart sank. The man was undoubtedly the same one who had picked him up hitchhiking. That man was John Wayne Gacy. I'm a 22-year-old female, and when I was 14, my family and I went to a resort in Antalya, Turkey. The resort was relatively small, and every day there There were plenty of activities that involved all the guests, like pool games and competitions. The restaurant was also cafeteria style, so everyone ate together. As a result, basically everyone at the resort knew each other well and by name, and became pretty close-knit after a few days. In particular, there was a middle-aged, bald British guy called Danny, and his two little kids were about 2 to 4. Everyone at the resort seemed to really love this family, as he was a single father who was on vacation and his 2 little kids were cute. So they became popular pretty quickly. At one point I was walking back up to my room when I heard another guest at the hotel say my name in the context of volunteering me to help Danny with something. I went to see what was going on, and the other guest told me that Danny needed help taking his kids upstairs because they were being badly sunburnt and he couldn't carry them both at once. However, the other guest was busy with something, so he suggested that I should help Danny instead. I didn't really think anything of it, so I picked up the little girl and walked with Danny and his son towards the elevator. We eventually got to his hotel room, and I tried to drop off the girl by the door, but he politely asked me to drop her off on the couch. Unfortunately, I was naive and too trusting, so I thought it wouldn't be a problem for me to just step in and drop her off, quickly, before I go. Worst case scenario, I would scream and people in the neighboring rooms or hallways would hear me. So I stepped inside, and as I dropped Danny's daughters off on the couch, he closed the door and turned the lights off behind me. It was pitch black, because my eyes hadn't adjusted yet, when I heard him leaning close to my ear and say, "Kids, say hello to your new mummy." I instantly got goosebumps all over and my heart dropped. Whenever I tell this story to anyone, they always say that he was probably kidding, but I can assure you 100% that he was not. I panicked and started feeling up the wall for the light switch or the door, and he could tell that I was trying to leave, so he said, "Aren't you going to stay and watch some telly with us?" But I'd finally found the doorknob and just made a run for it. I ran downstairs crying and so afraid. When I tried to tell my family, no one believed that he was being serious or creepy because they'd all met him and thought he was so sweet, a lovely, single father. I didn't see him the next day or in the following days, so I think he checked out after that. This story takes place nearly 30 years ago now, and is a memory I have spoken a lot about in therapy. The day was like any other. I got up in the morning, tired, and really couldn't be bothered to leave for school, but my mother was at my door nagging at me to get up. I open my eyes and take a good look around my room, spot my uniform on the chair from yesterday, and get ready to have a shower. Within about half hour, I'm ready to leave to school. I put on the bare minimum of makeup that we were allowed to wear and go sit at the table to have breakfast. I see my brother watching TV, and my dad is reading the newspaper. My mum looks like she's getting ready for another day of doing whatever she does at home, cooking, cleaning, and the like. She was also about 8 months pregnant. So we're just there having small talk before I look at my watch and realize I have to make the groggy journey to school. I walk down the 5 or 6 flights of stairs until I get to the bottom floor and slowly make my way out. I make the bus in good time and reach school before the bell. Now, school was a blur, and I don't remember what time it happened exactly, but from one moment to another, the ground started to shake. Earthquakes are not that uncommon where I live, but this one was different. This one was huge. We were instructed to all get underneath our desks. We all had individual desks at the time, and so we did. I could hear girls crying near me, even guys. Everyone was frightened. The ground was shaking, the ceiling. I was so scared it was going to collapse on me, and thankfully it did not. By the time the earthquake was over, we left. But when we looked out, we saw that we were fortunate. The amount of carnage that had been inflicted on our city was huge. Buildings that I had gone past on my bus ride were no longer standing. Streets were covered in debris and rubble, and there were cries and the sounds of emergency sirens everywhere. As you can imagine, with any situation like this, the first thing you think about is your family. I wondered about my brother. The last time I saw him was watching TV. Or my mum, her baby. My dad. How were they, and the rest of my family? I desperately wanted to leave, to run home and make sure my mum was okay. My dad worked across town. I didn't know if he was safe either. My brother went to this exact school, but I'm sure he'd be fine, right? Doubt is what really frightened me. Not knowing if that morning had been the last time I'd see my parents, if my ungrateful ass and not saying thank you to my mum would be the last gesture that she'd remember me if she had perished. It was about 5 hours or so before the school let us leave. Thankfully, during that time I found my brother, who was a few years younger, safe and sound, and I think I cried more than I ever had in my life when I found out he was alright. But the fear still consumed my heart, and I needed to find my family. Things didn't go well from this point on. My dad suffered serious injuries and unfortunately lost his life to them a few days later in the absolutely oversaturated hospitals. When I was finally allowed to go home, or at least a semblance of a home, I realized that our house was no longer standing. It was an apartment building, and it had pretty much collapsed. Eventually, they found my mother. She didn't make it. These things still haunt me, and was one of the reasons I moved from that country a long time ago. I still don't know if I'll ever go back. I'm deadly scared of earthquakes. I was still living at my dad's house when I was 17. It started the day we visited the house. I just got chills thinking about it. We were doing a house tour with the property seller from a company where my dad told me, "This is going to be your room." As soon as I entered, I knew I would never sleep there. I had that weird feeling like, no way am I going to sleep there. Finally, my dad bought the house. The first night I slept in that particular room, and I actually hadn't been able to sleep. I wasn't believing in ghosts, not sure if I still do, but there was something about this room I just wasn't able to explain, like a very strong bad feeling. I'm not someone who's ever been scared by this kind of stuff. The day after, I told my dad I would never sleep in that room again, and he saw I was dead serious. He knew I wasn't the kind of guy to care about this stuff, but actually, I did at the time. So he decided to build me a new room in this huge basement, like new walls and stuff. The room didn't even exist before we built it. A week or two went by, and then I started to hear voices in my imagination. It was just so strange. Then I started to hear an unmistakable knocking, softly on the walls for no reason, and doors that I knew were closed would open when I went to the bathroom at night. I told my dad, and he started to make fun of me by opening doors and knocking on the basement door, saying it wasn't him. My best friend came over, and he felt something strange too, and didn't want to come back to sleep even after when he was drunk. He was telling me things like, "No way am I sleeping in that basement again." After a month or so, I started getting sleep paralysis on a weekly basis. Scared the hell out of me. Never saw anything more than my empty room though. Actually, I never saw anything. Always strange feelings and doors that had been opened, and creepy voices in my head. I was a serious hockey player with no drugs or mental problems. And one day I was at my girlfriend's house and was talking to her about it. Her mum heard some of what I was saying and came immediately. She was some kind of medium and stuff. She listened to me and told me she would come and see what was going on. It's after that discussion I started really getting scared because I was more convinced There was a physical reasoning behind it all. She came, and I'll always remember the look she gave me. She immediately got out and told me there's one guy who's not happy, and he carries a very heavy weight on his foot, and there's another guy who only wants to make jokes. I'll take care of that. She also told me some of the things that were happening in the house, without me having told it to anyone. And from that moment on, nothing ever happened again. I asked her what she did, and she explained that she went to my bedroom, made them come to her, and then took them away from the house. I know it's weird, but the fact that nothing ever happened again creeps me out too. I'd like to add to the fact that I did some research afterwards. There was only one owner before my dad, and he confirmed that he built the house and nothing tragic ever happened there. I would also like to add that I'm French. So, you know, like from the moment she left the house and did her thing, nothing ever happened again. No sleep paralysis, no voice, no doors, no shaking, no knocking, no nothing. It still creeps me out just thinking about it. When I was about 11 years old, I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with my mother. We were very poor, and the bedroom had double sliding glass doors that led out the balcony. We lived on the 3rd floor for safety and the cheaper rent it offered. My mother often stayed in the living room late into the evening because she liked to watch TV before bed, and I preferred quiet. One night I was up on the top bunk. We had a bunk bed with a full-size mattress on the bottom and a twin on top, and my mum came into the room and called my name quietly. I'm a light sleeper, so woke up. She said, "There's someone on the back porch, don't move." She was standing just outside the doorway to the room, and had stopped entering when she saw the shadow of someone behind the blinds covering the glass door. The type of blinds that are flat when closed, but with the lights around the complex, you could see the shadows through them. I just remember being shocked that someone could get up onto a 3rd floor balcony. Then he started knocking really slowly. That's when I got scared. My mum went into the kitchen and dialed 911. I stayed as still as I could, hoping he would just go away. It couldn't have been more than 3 minutes, but the next time I opened my eyes, he was gone. When the police arrived about 3 minutes after, they looked all over the complex but could find no signs of him. When one of the officers went onto our balcony, there was no indication how he'd gotten up onto the 3rd floor, but there were 2 very evident palm prints where he'd leaned against the glass for who knows how long before my mum walked in. It never happened to us again. I hope it didn't happen to anyone else either. So me and this group of women, all of us friendly acquaintances that did group hikes, were hiking single file on a very thin trail through the mountains. My one problem with this group was that they insisted on talking loudly throughout the hike. I like to try and spot wildlife, so I ended up being in the front of the line in the hopes that I would see some critters before all the loud chatter drove them off. So I'm walking in the front, chilling, admiring all the thick forest and trees, and I take a step and put my foot down. As I do that, I hear a rustle. So I look down and I lift up my other foot to take another step. Less than an inch from my toes was this huge snake. I never saw how long it was, but it was around 3 inches in diameter and it started moving. Now this area had about 3 different types of rattlesnakes, along with copperheads, cottonmouths, and very rarely coral snakes. So I've been taught a healthy respect for snakes, as well as how to tell the difference between most of the species. I didn't even get a good look at the color before my hindbrain kicks in. This huge jolt runs through my body, like I stuck a fork in a socket. And before I even fully comprehend, oh hey, there's a snake, I'm 3 feet in the air and trying to travel backwards. I like to imagine it as one of those graceful anime leaps where they jump 20 back before a fight. But in reality it was more like a terrified cat springing into the air shouting, "Jesus Christ!" I crash into the woman behind me who yelps and turns to face me, but as she does she spots the snake and starts yelling at the top of her lungs. I was the one who nearly stepped on it, and this lady was more scared than I was. Well, the snake is no fool and decides, screw this, I was just chilling and sunning myself and these ladies come along and start screaming. I'm out of here. Thanks for ruining my morning. It slithers off into the undergrowth, and when it does, I see that its scales are pitch black. It is literally just a rat snake, both harmless and friendly. My grandma has 6-foot rat snakes living in her backyard, and she feeds them leftover chickens sometimes. Totally harmless. I felt like one hell of a fool, but that snake scared the bejesus out of me, and one of the other women took up the head of the lion for quite some time afterwards. At the time of these events, my brother, my father and I, a 16-year-old male, are road tripping through Nevada and California as my graduation gift. It was the end of August, and after a long trip coming from Las Vegas, cruising through Los Angeles and heading north across California, we decided to stay in beautiful Santa Barbara for a few days. My father finds a motel not too far from the beach, and we were all in wonder as to the movie-like beauty of the city we're staying in. In the evening of our first night there, being back to the motel shortly after feasting on greasy and savory pizza from Rusty's Pizza Parlor, and walking along one of the most beautiful beaches in the USA, I start to get bored in the room. After having watched the television with my father and brother for about an hour, to change the scenery a bit, I decide to peek through our room window. As I kneel on the raspy purple carpet floor and draw the thick and heavy curtains out, a sense of dread takes hold of my whole being. I'm startled by the thing I see right across the street, about 100 feet from my window. What I'm looking at is at odds with the beautiful, picture-like frame created by the motel lobby entrance arch, delimiting it from my field of view. A beautiful shadow and light setting created by the streetlight beam on the pavement of the other side of the road reveals this man, whose physical traits are hooded by the shadows cast down towards by the light. Right under the streetlight, he is standing half in the light, half in the dark of night, as if the knowing of the effect the light has on him. He looks like he's in his late 20s, early 30s, and stares right at me. His gaze like a laser beam, and I can feel it all the way down to my kidneys. I can't see his crazy eyes from the distance, but I can feel them, and my subconscious picks up on the intent, which isn't good. He seems to have waited for me to look at him for a long time, as if he knew it would happen. He seems to have known, just as you know when you'll hear thunder after seeing lightning. A few seconds after he's made aware of my awareness of his presence, still staring at me, he starts, in a slow clockwork motion, sliding his index finger sideways across his throat, underneath his jaw from right to left, over and over, as if he's silently telling me, "I'll kill you." That's right. As the floor beneath me starts to sink, and a little taste of metal overwhelms the top of my tongue, I close the curtains as quick as if my life depended on it. Then, I turn my upper body away from the window towards my father and tell him what I've seen. He just kind of shrugs it off, talking over the baseball game on TV, and tells me to let it go. But I can feel, along with this calm vibe of arrogant carefreeness coming from him, a hint of uneasiness that I can taste in the back of my mouth. 30 seconds go by, and I stupidly kneel uncomfortably again on the motel carpet below the windowsill. After loudly swallowing for luck, against my best judgment, I draw the curtains out a second time, but this time my hand stops at the width of my head, allowing to view just enough of the outside world to be able to grasp what was happening outside of my seemingly safe motel room. There he is again. This time though, the man is standing 2/3 of the way to where he stood the first time I saw him. His facial traits are now darkened by the lack of streetlight, but I can still feel his crazy glare. He is under the hotel lobby parking lot arch. There's not much light there where he stands, but I can still perceive him doing his throat-slicing gesture, and is still communicating it to me through the pantomime. There is this desperate feeling of unfair doom in realizing that your poor vulnerable self is the target of something malicious, that doesn't know you as being with needs and fears, but knows and wants something from you which you are oblivious to. I'm starting to feel queasy and frightened. I close the curtain quickly once again and tell my dad of the man's presence, and he's approaching the room. I get on the bed trying to concentrate on the TV to forget what I'd just witnessed. I don't remember if my dad looked through the window to confirm what was happening, but I remember him telling me to stop looking outside if that's what was scaring me, and that we were safe in the room, which is locked. After what seemed like a few minutes passing, I peek again for the final time. This time the man is right in the parking lot, about 50 feet from our motel room, doing his gesture again. I start thinking that this man is probably mentally ill or something, and that I better stop looking at the window again. A clever thing to do, I tell myself. The man's behavior, although redundant and pathetic, nevertheless strikes me as being ominous and frightening. The night goes on with that feeling that even if I'm probably safe inside our room, there is this disturbed man missing a few cogs who's got nothing to lose outside the room, that behaves as if he wants nothing good for me. Would he be grinning or not? Would he raise his arms to gently tap the window while kneeling under the windowsill? I try not to think about it, and I sleep very uneasily that night. The following morning, not wanting to go outside of the room, I decide to stay in with my brother while my dad goes into the motel lobby to fetch orange juice breakfast and to speak to the motel clerk about the man outside. My father comes back after a few minutes with our breakfast and tells me that the clerk told him the guy who frightened me the night before is known in the area for his mental illness. He's probably a schizophrenic. And my dad then reassured me that the clerk told him he's not dangerous, and that we're safe staying there for a few more nights. Luckily, I never see the man again for the duration of our stay. Fast forward a few years. My father and I are reminiscing about our trip to California, and specifically about those days in Santa Barbara, when the mentally ill man threatened me with his finger outside our motel room as mentioned in the conversation. My father, as if relieved from not having to keep this secret anymore, lets out that the morning after that dreadful night, the motel clerk had in fact told him to be careful with the man. He had told him that in fact he was dangerous. My dad just didn't want to scare us by telling us the truth. I thanked him for lying to me that morning, and we agreed that we were lucky that we didn't see that man again. The house I lived in was haunted. Best I give you some history. I was a kid when I first moved in, and lived there for over 15 years. I moved out for reasons unrelated to anything. My mum bought this house from the original owners who had built it. The original owners had one daughter who worked for a famous politician. She met an unfortunate end that people find shady. The parents moved somewhere else after losing their only child, and eventually had the house I lived in built. Not sure how long they lived there, but we bought it and they moved into a nursing home. Soon after I moved in, I would hear what sounded like a little girl saying, "Hey," exactly like someone just trying to get someone's attention. I would be in my bedroom, and it sounded like it was coming from the front door. I go to the front door and no one was ever there. This was also in the middle of the day. The only children I remember wouldn't have been babies, or not even been born yet when this happened. It happened repeatedly a few times a day, on and off. My family is Buddhist, and we got a family friend to set up some shrines to protect us. The haze stopped, and all was well for a while. We never stopped having those shrines, and they're still there despite more things eventually happening. My house is oddly long. Family room / basement door is on one side of the house, followed by the kitchen, living room, and then bedroom areas. Only my mum and I lived there for quite a time. One day I was home alone and heard the distinct sound of someone going up the stairs. The door to come up, opening and closing, and footsteps walking towards the bedroom. I was in my bedroom, which is the first one after that stretch of the house. I wasn't spooked, as I really did think it was my mum coming home in the afternoon. but no one was there at all. Years went by, and my then boyfriend, now fiance, moved in for a bit. As a heads up, he's had paranormal stuff happen to him previously. He got the middle guest room. The following will be his experiences. One of my ugly dolls was in his room on his bed. He wasn't a fan of it and put it on the floor one day. When he woke up next morning, it was back on the bed next to him. Neither my mum or I moved that doll. That long stretch from the bedroom to the other side of the house, he never liked it. Felt like he was being watched and not by anything good. I'd also like to add that I was always rushed through that hallway at night, with lights on if I had to. So we were never fans of that wall. It got better when we adopted 3 cats, who mainly stayed in the family room on the other side, like they formed a bridge between the 2 areas. One day he came home from work one morning, 3rd shift, and noticed the lights behind my mum's bedroom would turn on by themselves. They didn't have any motion or timer. My mum was at work. I have also seen a door that was open later be closed without anyone around, but I didn't witness the act itself. Another thing I heard a few times was the sound of a bouncing ball outside my house. This was years ago, so I can't recall what kind of ball it sounded like, but imagine a kid just bouncing a ball on concrete repeatedly nearby. But it was only in the middle of the night, and there is no hard surface near that corner of the house, just grass and dirt. The driveway is on the whole other side of the house. So the house now has 3 people. One day, due to work and travel, I was home alone. I was in my room and heard a very distinct knock on my closed door. From the rhythm to the volume, it sounded exactly like how my mum would playfully knock on my door to get my attention. 3 lightish knocks in quick succession. I remember being very, very scared about this because whatever it was imitating my mum. I did a lot of praying for protection that night. Finally, we arrive at the last incident. If you notice, everything I had experienced had either been something that changed but I didn't witness or something audible. This was my first visual experience. This happened with my mum and dad in the house at night. My fiancé had moved out by then. My dad was in the kitchen cooking for the next day. My mom was in the guest room and I was in my own room laying on the floor on my stomach on my laptop. My actual computer desk is so full of crap, I chose the floor. I was turned away from the entrance with the door to the right of my feet from my point of view. The door was closed, the lights were on, and in the reflection of my laptop monitor I saw someone pass from left to right, with the lights behind me, and seeing from the display that's on, I can't say I saw any details, but the lights were interrupted by a figure walking past, like someone was going from the door to my room and passing the lights. The way the reflection looked seemed something out of the ordinary, and I thought it was my mum messing with me. I quickly turned around, but naturally no one was there in the room with me. The door was still shut, and no one could have opened the door, walked back and forth and left that quickly and quietly. I immediately checked on my mum in the room right next to me. I had to eliminate any doubt, even with the unnatural speed a human wouldn't had time to sneak out. She was on the bed with blankets, a lap desk, a laptop, and busy as a bee. No way my dad could have done anything like that. He's old and not quiet. So that was my second fearful incident. I'm not gonna lie, I did not feel comfortable sleeping in my room for quite a while after that. Just the culmination of all of this was getting freaky for me. We went to a Buddhist temple to get some stuff done. I was planning on moving out soon, and didn't want whatever this was following me. So far, so good. Despite my mum having her fair share of ghostly experiences in her home country, when she was a youngster, she never experienced anything in this house. My dad as well. We actually didn't want to tell him any of this as we didn't want to spook him. In summary, I feel like maybe the beginning may have had something to do with the daughter of the original homeowners, although she never lived here and definitely wasn't a little girl when she passed. It's like she was looking for where her parents lived last. I don't know. Maybe she regressed to a more innocent time of her life with her child's voice. As for the rest, I have no idea. I'm just happy that I'm not feeling that fear anymore. I used to climb at Joshua Tree a lot a decade ago, so we would camp there frequently. One Halloween we were hanging out by the fire and a group of 3 guys walk up and ask if we wanted to head to the Chasm of Doom. Without hesitation I replied, yeah, sure. My friends were less enthusiastic, but I was able to convince them to come along. This place had a certain amount of legend surrounding it in J-tree climbing circles, so it was somewhat known to us, but we still had yet to get there. This was pre-Instagram, so there wasn't much info on it at the time, other than how to get there and its Talus Cave. As we walked over, the guys were filling us in on the tradition of the chasm. Always take first timers at night, no headlamps or lights allowed. The leaders shout beta. Instructions were to go on, what to avoid, and how not to die. If you have to follow it, you want to make it through. If you cheat and use a light while in there, you risk upsetting the spirits or something, and we laughed that off. As we reached the end of our walk to the entrance of the cave, one of our guides asked if any of us had claustrophobia issues. I laughed and asked why, to which they described the birth canal, a horizontal crack that you have to wiggle through at some point in the cave that was very cramped. After hearing this, one of my friends noped out of there, and being that the other friend and he were dating at the time, they both decided to leave and return to camp. That left me standing at the base of a hill ready to scramble up the mouth of a cave with 3 strangers I'd met 15 minutes ago to be led through, blind. Sounds perfectly safe and rational. We scramble up over boulders, under boulders, past yucca sprouting from cracks, rats scurried around, and the mood was starting to rise above the mountains across the valley as we reached the mouth of the chasm. It was a vertical crack no more than a few feet wide. We file in one by one, with the leader instructing us where to step, where to place our hands for balance, and warning us about protrusions from the ceiling so we don't hit our heads. The pace was slow, and it was not terribly interesting for the first few minutes, as I was more interested in how my brain was shifting the way it perceives physical space through touch rather than sight. In the complete darkness, I was constructing a 3-dimensional map of the cave in my head. It felt like I was looking at the physical space, even in the pitch black. For a while, I remained more fascinated by this than the actual activity, up until the point where the ground had been relatively flat with some small obstacles to avoid so you didn't trip and fall on your face. The leader had just instructed us that there was a large boulder you had to crouch under, and then immediately after there would be something that you had to climb over. He did not state any details about these objects, so figuring out your way around them was all up to you and your appendages to identify the parameters of the space that you were in and how to navigate it. Again, this all felt fascinating until I tried to climb over it. I was last in line and everyone was still here, so I knew that moving forwards was not going to result in my death or anything, but my confidence was completely sucked out of me by a very simple comment by the leader. When you climb over, make sure you stay to the right. If you go too far to the left, you'll fall. At this point, the wonder of the process of navigating through the cave gave way to a growing sense of anxiety over real risk or injury. My relaxed state was now being corrupted by scenarios of falling down a hole in complete darkness. To make matters worse, when I gingerly tried to reach down to the other side of my toes to find solid footing, all I found was air. I wondered how far down was ground beneath me. Was I in the wrong position? Am I dangling over a potential fall? I had long gotten over my fear of heights thanks to climbing, but this created a unique form of vertigo. All the physiological responses were there: tense muscles, anxiety, disorientation, and I felt stuck. Part of me wanted to go back, but being that everyone had already passed it, the thought of navigating my way back out solo seemed not only risky for my physical well-being, but my pride too. I was tense with anxiety, but convinced myself to just commit to whatever drop there was. I let it go. and started to fall. A total of 2 inches. Along the way there were more situations like this, including some sections that required climbing blind, making a wrong turn and backtracking. Even though I had come to realize that my anxiety was also flying blind, I tried to rationalize it away. It still persisted. It didn't help that the leader was dramatizing every danger to make us think we got lost. We all talked crap to lighten the mood when it got too much. Finally, we got to the birth canal. They worked their way through it, and I listened to each of their complaints as they struggled with it, hoping to have an easier go. I wasn't terribly claustrophobic being stuck in a tight place in the dark, but it wasn't something I wanted to experience. I turned around, lied on my back, and started through head first. If you can imagine a penguin trying to move between 2 mattresses on his back, you can imagine the position I was in. Movement was slow and restrained. My back slid on a slab and my chest was pressed against the roof. I got stuck. I had to back out a bit, move in a slightly different trajectory, and find a spot that had more clearance. Finally, I made it through and had to climb up about 10 feet until I rejoined the group on the top of some boulder. We were now boulder hopping back over the chasm we had just navigated through. Essentially, it's just a crack in the rocks and large boulders would fall in and get stuck, essentially creating a roof. To continue, we had to head back the way we came, following the chasm back. It felt like we were in a Donkey Kong level in a sense. The boulders didn't completely cover the chasm and the drops were about 15 to 30 feet according to the leader. I wasn't sure if it was an exaggeration at first, but by the time we reached the end of that section, the moonlight was shining through, and I could see that any fall would be very serious. Finally made it to the top and climbed some sketchy slab to get a great view of the valley being lit by the moon. We yelled down to other people heading into the mouth of the cave, and sat there for a while taking in the afterglow of the adrenaline, drank a beer, and laughed off the melodrama of the whole endeavor. It was honestly one of the most fun things I'd ever done, but it certainly scared the crap out of me. We then had to find our way down, which ended up requiring some awkward down climbs as we ended up going the wrong way. At least we had the moon for that part. Back in the 70s/early 80s, my mother lived in Sydney, Australia. She was in her early 20s at the time, and like most youth in those days attended a lot of discos. One night, Mum and her female friend had just stepped out of a disco and were about to head home. Mum's friend, however, was heavily intoxicated from all the drinking and could barely walk, so she planned to walk her friend home, then head to her own apartment. They'd hardly walked a few paces before a car pulled up beside them, with 2 young men inside in their late 20s. They wound their windows down and called to the women, offering them a ride. My mum declined and was about to continue walking, but her drunk friend told her she wanted to join the men, and my mum asked if she could accompany her. Now her friend was about to get into a car with 2 strange men, and considering how intoxicated she was, Mum developed a bad feeling letting her friend go alone inside the car with 2 total strangers. She reluctantly agreed. They both got in the car with the men. They told the men where they wanted to be let off, and away they went. As they drove, the men made friendly conversation, and nothing seemed overwhelmingly off for the moment. However, it wasn't long before the conversation started to turn flirtatious, and it soon became clear the men weren't driving them to the location they'd asked for. They had started to head out the city and into the rural suburbs. Mum's friend was so out of it that she was oblivious to this, busy, preoccupied with conversation. By this stage, all of the red flags were going off for my mum, and she wanted to desperately get out of there. Eventually, the men pulled up outside a forest reserve and ordered the women to get out. Now the men's voices were demanding and no longer friendly. Terrified, my mum, who wanted to sprint away, still couldn't bring herself to do so as her drunk friend was being led into the woods. Mum followed until the 2 men attempted to pin them against trees and make advances on them. Now my mum was full-on fight mode, and began scratching, punching and kicking at the 2 men who were also fighting back. Her friend, now aware of the horrific ordeal, was also trying to defend herself but was significantly more vulnerable due to her weakened state. Mum eventually managed to injure the man attacking her enough to move on to the other who was attacking her friend. She fought with all her might until they managed to break away, covered with scratches and bruises. The men didn't follow, but hurriedly got into the car and sped away. Mum and her friend ran up to the nearest house, hysterical and bleeding from all the scuffles. They asked the woman living there to call the cops, and she did so promptly, taking my mother and her friend in. Unfortunately, the cops never caught the man, but my mum became far more cautious and aware of her surroundings, and used this story to warn my sister and I. 2 years ago, my husband and I flew to LA for a weekend getaway. We stayed at a boutique hotel off Sunset. It's more of a hipster type place, not normally somewhere I'd stay, but it was nice, clean and had good vibes. We met up with our friends who live in LA and went out for dinner and drinks. It was a late night and we came back to the hotel. I was exhausted and jet-lagged. It was 1:30 a.m. or something like that. My husband is a very deep sleeper. I'm an extremely light sleeper, except when I've had a bunch of drinks, which I had definitely consumed that night. So it was lights out for both of us very quickly. Around 3 a.m. I suddenly wake up and open my eyes. There's a light on in our room. The room had been totally dark when we went to bed. The light came from the doorway, which illuminated the silhouette of a man standing at the foot of the bed, just standing there staring. For a moment I'm speechless, confused, and also slightly intoxicated and haven't moved. My reaction is delayed, and then the stark fear and reality kick in. I grasp and say, "What the hell?" The man was wearing a red plaid shirt and had dark hair and a beard. I couldn't make out his features as my eyes were adjusting to waking up, and the lighting that illuminated him shadowed half his face. The man says, "I need to speak to Drake." I know this may sound somewhat comical, but I assure you at the time it was terrifying. So I scream, "Get the hell out of here!" which jolts my husband awake, who immediately sits up and sees this man at the foot of our bed. My husband is 6'5", which may not be evident given half his body is underneath the bedding, but either way the man responds, "Sorry, wrong room," and bolts out, slamming the door shut behind him. My husband jumps up and runs for the door, but I stop him from going outside into the hallway. Who knows if the man is waiting there trying to lure him out, or whether other people are there ready to pounce. I keep looking through the peephole but don't see anything. At this point we are both shocked and in disbelief and probably still drunk. We call down to the front desk but no one answers. We call repeatedly and still no one replies. We contemplate what to do, and around 20 minutes later we decide to get dressed and go down to the front desk. There is an employee at the front desk and there's also a bar in the lobby. My husband walks around to see if he can spot the guy who was in our room. As he's searching, I go up and start telling the guy behind the front desk what happened. But as I begin this story, I burst into tears, and it's only then that I realize how shaken up I am about it all. The employee gets the manager and he asks me what time the man came into the room, but I don't know how long he was standing there until I woke up and saw him. I think he must have been there a while for me to just wake up. My husband comes back empty-handed. We go back up to the room. The next day the manager calls and says there wasn't anything on the security cameras, but I didn't believe him. He offers us a free night as compensation. Even though he claims he didn't see anything, we take the free night because what else can you do? We just want to go about the rest of our mini vacation. Why was the man in our room? How did he have a working key card? But the thought I have most trouble with, what would have happened if I hadn't have woken up? Our door was locked, but clearly someone had a duplicate key card. Here's what I've learned. If you don't already, always put the deadlock on your hotel room door. In something we never thought to do, and now I always check it twice. My husband, my daughter and I moved into our colonial-style farmhouse last October. It was built in 1900, has 5 wooded acres that are about miles of conservation, and we have 2 neighbors far apart, both older retired people who would drive to our house if they needed to see us. which one has done, and they seem nice. When we moved into the house, my daughter started talking about an Uncle Fungo and wouldn't elaborate on it except to say Uncle Fungo is here. She was 2.5, so I figured it was from her show she watches, and still might be. He was mainly mentioned while playing with toys in the bath. It was fine until she said while playing, "Girls are trash." I was horrified, since she's not around anyone that would say anything like that. Plus, all the shows she watches are her screen age appropriate. So, where did she hear that? I ask her, and she says that Uncle Fungo said it. Anyway, I dropped the subject being weirded out, but fortunately she never spoke about it anymore. It was a very odd thing, and she'd never made up people before. We've also had incredibly bad luck while living here, but we love the place anyway, and I don't feel like there's anything necessarily bad or evil within the house. While exploring our woods, I found a wreck of a very old car in the woods that must have crashed down the hill and been left there. The trees grew around it and it looked rather somber. Must have been a bad crash too, since it's in a bad shape. Kind of eerie and unsettling. Not sure if that means the place is haunted or not. It's just the knocking that bothers me. Last January, my daughters were playing in the living room, and she can see the office from there. She yells to me while I'm in the kitchen that she sees something in the office and she's upset. I turn the light on in there since it's usually dark in that room, and there's nothing. I walk back to the kitchen and hear a very loud knock at what sounds like the front door. My daughter yells, "Visitors!" and we both go to the back door to find no one there. No cars around, and a passerby prankster knocker is highly unlikely due to our location. It freaked me out so much I called my husband. He said it was probably a woodpecker. It sounded nothing like a woodpecker, but I let it go. Months have passed, and it's been a hard year overall, not really having my mind on odd happenings. Now just yesterday, my daughter and I are getting ready for her dance class, and we hear a more normal knock. We both hear it and assume it's our neighbor who drives over sometimes. Unfortunately, it wasn't, and I'm freaked out. It's the knocking again. We've heard plenty of other sounds in the house, but that one is so specific. My boyfriend and I were doing a road trip around Scotland last year. We were sleeping in the car during the nights and would get up, pack everything, and head somewhere else the next day. One night we stayed in this gorgeous bay right by the sea. Beautiful sunset, lots of other campers, it was ideal. We liked it so much we wanted to hang around the area a bit longer, so the next night we stayed in the same bay. However, when I got back to the bay to set up camp for the night, there was no one else there. Bit weird, but whatever, no big deal. It was late when we arrived and it was already starting to get a bit dark. My boyfriend started cooking dinner. As he was doing so, I decided to take some rubbish over to the bins about 100 feet away. I got to the bins and suddenly heard this weird hissing sound at the top of the cliffs next to us. It just kept going on and on up there, then it stopped, so I thought it might be owls. They do weird stuff like that, right? Then I heard it again, only this time it was coming down the cliff to my level, and it was approaching me. I shone the torch around, but couldn't see anything, so I legged it back to the car and told my boyfriend. He sort of shrugged and carried on cooking, then suddenly stopped. He looked off to where I heard the noise for a moment, then started packing the car. I asked him what was going on, but he just said to keep packing. We got in the car, packed up, and we were preparing to leave when headlights came from down the lane. A police van drove past towards the end of the bay and looped back and left again. No idea what that was about. Either way, we left the bay and found somewhere more populated to stay. When I asked my boyfriend why he'd wanted to leave so quickly, he said he heard the exact same thing I had heard, the hissing from up the cliffs, descending to our level and approaching, getting louder. Noped right out of that place the very next morning. This happened during our long weekend getaway, a while ago. My friends and I decided we deserved a bit of a break from our usual surroundings. and targeted somewhere 3 hours away for a 4-day weekend. We tried booking for a beach house either south or central coast, but due to demand with the pandemic and everyone wanting a local getaway, as well as school holidays, we couldn't find a suitable location which would fit 14 people. Luckily, I found a place a 5-hour drive away from our area. Not the usual place we'd normally go. This was a good 1 hectare area, unusually shaped home in the middle of it all with a saltwater pool right in front of the house, with the next house a good 500 meters away or more. We normally go for beachside accommodation, but due to the aforementioned reason we had to settle for this one. You can tell when the property ended as it was fenced, but there was a gate that is chest high with a padlock, which we didn't have the key to, which had a latch, so pretty much anyone can just open and close as they please, and this detail is important for the story. We didn't really worry about it that much, as we were away from everyone else, which means that we can do karaoke and watch scary movies without worrying about noise. It was an amazing break and accommodation, but for one particular event. In total, we took 5 cars. We parked our cars close to where the fenced pool is, as we came in staggered stages. Check-in was at 3 p.m. on Friday, and 9 of our friends were already there by the time we started to drive. They shared photos and videos of the place and were already enjoying themselves. The views and facilities, myself, my fiancé's sister, and 2 other friends left close to 7 p.m. and got to the area past midnight. It was a creepy drive for the final 2 kilometers as it was extremely dark, and you have to drive past tall trees with no lampposts and cross the train tracks to get entry out of the place. Our friends greeted us at the gate, as they were worried about the darkness. We parked our cars, caught up with them before heading to bed at around 2. Saturday came and we had brekkie, went up for a drive up north to check out the sights, and went back before dark as we needed to use the outside grill for our dinner. I didn't really want anyone to hang out outside in the dark, as there's no visibility, and can't ever be too safe. We had drinking games inside, the girls did karaoke, while taking soju shots until 3 a.m. The next day, the topic was the fun that we'd had the night before, and one of the girls threw up from all the uncontrolled drinking. We had late breakfast and planned to have sausage sizzle, which is grilled sausages squeezed in a piece of white bread with caramelized onion and your choice of barbecue or tomato sauce. For lunch, again, when that required the outside grill. I wasn't fast as it was 2 p.m. and most of us were just hanging in the pool area, which was adjacent from the dining area next to the grill. As we were eating, my view is towards the cars, and where we would be coming from if we decided to go to the pool area from the main house. When I see this woman wearing a pink bucket hat, and I was wondering who it could be from our group, and quickly realized she wasn't part of our group. I thought she was one of the distant neighbors, and we were too loud the night before and that the noise traveled and she was there to complain. Others thought that she'd booked the place and maybe there was a problem with the booking. But she approached and said, I apologize, I know you guys are here to have fun and have a bit of a break, but I used to own this place until it was turned into an Airbnb by the current owner. By this time she was standing in front of us in the center, and she took off her hat and we saw that she's most likely been through chemotherapy. I sold this house in 2018, and it was a very hard decision. I was wondering if I could take a look inside the house and maybe quickly show my friends what it looks like on the inside, as it's an architecturally designed home and very unique. My fiancé's brother quickly said, no, while some of the girls were looking at each other considering her request, as she seemed genuinely emotional and looked like she'd been through something. I followed up with, we're checking out tomorrow morning. I can contact the current owner and let her know that you want to check the place out after we leave. She quickly responded, no, it's alright. Are you guys from Sydney? We responded that we were, and she said that she now lives round there too, and is staying nearby for the next week, and was trying her luck in having a look at the house. It seemed she was establishing that she was the previous owner, and she mentioned that the new owners added an additional tank, and asked if the garden towards the back of the property has been removed because it was a problem before, and asked if the red chandeliers still existed. We knew the chandelier is white, not red, and if we had access to all rooms including the ones next to the grill, as we only had access to one of the 2 rooms as the other was padlocked, we said yes. I quickly had a look towards the gate and saw that there was a 4WD right outside blocking it. One of my friends had the wit to ask her name and if she knew the current owners, or maybe she could ask them for permission instead. She responded with, "My name's Karen, and we exchanged paperwork online, so I didn't really know them personally." She then asks if she can just have a look outside, and we let her. About 30 seconds later, she comes back and asks what the current owners have done with the part of the area. We mentioned we didn't know and it's probably owned by the neighbor. She then responded with, "Oh, the owner's father owns that property." She thanked us and walked towards the gate, all the while checking out the house. I then messaged the owner letting her know that there was a woman there called Karen who wanted to check the house out. The owner replied saying, "That's odd, there's no previous owner named Karen. I'll let the caretaker who lives down the road know about this." We created all these scenarios in our head. What if the padlocked room was where she wanted to check out? We didn't see her friends, so we didn't know who we had to deal with. We are glad we didn't let her in as we didn't know what anyone's capable of. Also, we pointed out her bravery in approaching a group of strangers to check out the house when she could have easily contacted the owner to ask her instead if she had a week in the area. We then checked out the property history and found that the house was built in 07, sold in 13 and again in 2018. The property photos had the red chandelier prior to it being sold in 2013, which means it wasn't hers to begin with. Her spiel made it sound like she had the house built and she lived on the property for a good 10 years. We were pretty much on edge that night. Every little noise we would jump at assuming it was her and her friends coming back to take a closer look. Who knows what her plans really were? I'm gonna be honest. Men usually never hit on me or approach me at all. This is because I am a very large woman. It is weird when they do. It's only happened twice in the last 6 or 7 years. The first of those times was okay, a little uncomfortable since I was in an elevator with this complete stranger in my apartment building, and he kept asking me out for coffee. I know I'm not attractive, so I never believe people will act like I am. I'm also not looking to date. This second time, however, just happened recently. After work, I took the bus down to the grocery store. It's a few minutes in the opposite direction from my apartment, but they have some pretty good deals, so I like to go at least once per month. As I started walking away from the bulk foods area, this is the only store with sesame glazed cashews, so I was getting some, I heard someone say something like, "Hey." There were other people in the area, so I figured this person was trying to get the attention of a deli or baker employee nearby. I saw him out of the corner of my eye, but paid no attention and walked off to continue my shopping. I had used the phone in the store that automatically rings up the taxi company to call my ride before exiting, and walked off to the side where the benches are to wait for it to arrive. A few people walked behind the bench, as they also left. Then one stopped and said, "Hello." I still paid no attention. The only person I talked to besides customers at work is my sister, and she was back in our apartment. He came a little closer, cleared his throat and said, "Excuse me." I turned. It was the guy. It was then I realized he had been trying to get my attention inside the store earlier. "Oh, hello." I smiled. I really am anxious out in public, but I'm decent at faking friendliness. "Do you live around here?" "No, I'm just waiting for my ride home." "Ah, you know, I live over there." He pointed at the townhouse complex across the street. "I can give you a ride if you like." Well, that was fast and forward. "Oh, thanks, that's all right. I already called my ride and it's on its way." "Are you certain that they're coming? Because it's no problem to drive you." I assured him that my ride was on its way, and he kept trying over and over to get me to come with him despite my polite refusals. He offered to put his phone number in my phone so I could call him any time, day or night, and he would come pick me up. Well, that was creepy. I told him the truth and said I didn't have a cell phone. He immediately challenged that by asking how I called for a ride then, and I said there was a phone inside the store that I used. He chuckled and asked, "Are you worried if I give you a ride your husband would kill me?" Husband? Yeah, right. I'm 35 and have never even had a boyfriend. Oh, he might. He can sometimes get like that. Best if I just take the cab when it arrives, I lied. Well, you don't have to tell him that I gave you the ride. That wouldn't be very honest of me. Besides, the folks at the taxi company know who I am, so I can't just no-show. Which is true. I've been a regular for the past 6 years and they know me by voice now. He then asked where I was from, and I said that I was from this general area. He said that he was from Africa. I could tell that already. So I politely asked which country. He told me and then started talking about being from a tribe and how tribes would fight each other for things, mostly about how whichever tribe won, they could marry women from the other tribe and not have to pay for that privilege and whatnot. I was just praying that my cab would come soon. I kept turning to check. When it finally arrived, I stood up and said, "Looks like my ride's here." He said it was nice to talk to me, and as I was putting my bags in the car, I hopped in the cab, thanked the cabbie for finally saving me, and we were off. That guy must have offered me a ride at least a dozen times. But that wasn't the end of it. As I was getting my stuff out the cab once arriving to the complex, as there are multiple buildings and our parking lot sloped down a hill, and I am at the top of the hill, the man drove past me. He didn't live here too. He followed me. I don't know what he hoped to accomplish since the buildings are secured and he doesn't know my first name, let alone my last, which is the only building listed outside the buzzer. I hustle my fat butt into the building and hope I don't meet the guy again. A couple of friends and I drove into a horror movie once, by accident. It was either late November or early December, about 5 or 6 years ago. I was deeply religious at the time and we were heading to one of those living nativity things where they have pretend actors to be the Virgin Mary, Joseph, the wise men, etc. And they kind of put on an outdoor show. It was held at a Christian campground outside of a nearby city, and we didn't know the area very well. We had someone give us directions. This was winter in the US, so it was already getting dark when we set out. We got to the area just fine, but we forgot the name of the exit we were supposed to take to reach the grounds. Luckily, the campgrounds had a big sign right next to an exit, so we assumed this was the way to go. We took the road and thought nothing of it. Crisis averted. The city this campground is next to is actually pretty large, and the exit we took is very close to a shopping district, so it wasn't like we started in the middle of nowhere. But very abruptly the exit turned from civilization to deep woods. We thought, well, it's a campground, so that's about right, and carried on driving. Pretty soon we passed a clearing on the right. The clearing was maybe 50 feet, and then woods again. And at the very edge of the woods, it wasn't full night yet so you couldn't see, was this huge stone gate with wrought iron doors. It looked like a cemetery gate, but it didn't lead to a path or anything, just trees. Had no fence around it either, just gate. So we kept going, remarking to each other that it was kind of creepy, but still we didn't think much of it. It was starting to get foggy at this point. I felt like maybe I should point out that despite it being winter, it wasn't that cold, and there wasn't any snow. A little while later, we came to some houses, and this is where things got weird. The first house was just standard white suburban house, but in the driveway, which was very short, was a van with all the doors open. The hazard lights were on too. The car was on, but nobody was in or around it, and the house was completely dark. We were a little nervous now, wondering if maybe something bad had happened, like an accident or something, and the driver of our car slowed down to look. Then my other friend in the front pointed ahead, and it turns out all of the houses on the street were like this on both sides of the road. Lights out, cars in the driveway, all of the doors on the cars open with the hazards on. At this point we were more than a little freaked out, thinking we'd driven straight into Silent Hill or a particularly mean prank if nothing else. Though it seems a little strange for it to just be a community-wide prank in the middle of winter, nowhere close to Halloween. We still haven't seen any people, mind you. For whatever reason, we still continue to drive, maybe to get out of there faster. There was a little bend in the road, and the instant we started through it, this massive black dog, sort of German Shepherd looking thing, came out of nowhere and ran full tilt to the driver's side of the car. I'm still not sure if the dog actually made contact with the car, but if not, it did get incredibly close. After charging at us, it didn't retreat either. It stayed in the road, barking its heads off. Our driver did a quick U-turn and we got out of there as fast as possible, ditching the nativity thing, and never tried to go back. We found out when we got home and talking to the person who gave us directions that it wasn't even the right exit we were on. And now, several years later, we're not exactly sure which exit we took that night. All I know is I'm glad we chose to get out of there when we did. I didn't want any part of whatever was going on that night. Hard pass, no thanks. This is the first time I share anything like this, but I need to get it off my chest because it's been freaking me out for years, and I can't talk to any of my friends about it because they don't believe me. I have a long list of things that have happened to me over the years we've been in the house I currently live in, and I am a 20-year-old college student since the time of this post. The first event I can remember was when I was around 5 or 6. This is shortly after my brother passing away from cancer. I had a babysitter with me who knew me since just after I was able to walk. I don't remember her much after this event, but she was extremely nice. Anyway, I walked into the entrance area in my house that has stairs going to the upstairs. This area is connected to the dining room, living room and kitchen. I saw a man walking down the stairs with what seemed like a Civil War attire. When he got to the landing and turned to go down the rest of the stairs, he looked me dead in the eyes and moved his mouth like he was talking, but I couldn't hear him. In response, I turned to call my babysitter Emma, and I turned back and he was gone. I don't know what to think of that besides an overactive imagination, but I don't think so. Shortly after this event, Emma quit because she got scared. I don't remember saying this, but according to my parents, I said something along the lines of, "He doesn't like you," and her, before she almost got into a crash a few days later. The second and third events all happened in a 2-year time period. I usually have to bring the Christmas decorations back to the basement in mid-January. It was a normal day and we just boxed all the Christmas tree ornaments, so I had to go and put them in the corner of the basement, where we have random stuff from when my parents first got married to where they first moved into the house after it got built. We put the box down, and as I'm still walking back to the stairs, I heard a faint girl's voice whisper something behind me. My hairs stood on end, and I book it up the stairs and start crying. They don't listen to me since I'm only 10 at the time, and a year comes and goes, and I've steeled myself for this moment, again, thinking I just heard the TV that's directly above me. But again I hear a girl's voice saying something, but this time it was in my ear. The fourth event happens in a very similar way a few years later, since I refused to go to the basement alone. I go down there because I needed to grab something out of the fridge for my dad, and I already didn't want to be down there. Just as I'm leaving, I hear a girl laugh, coming from the corner of the basement, where the other 2 events happened, and one of the pipes starts making a similar noise to a teapot boiling. This was the first and only time this ever happened in the house. The 5th event was from when I was around 13 to 14. It was late at night, and I was sleeping, and I remember when something opened the door to my room and walked in. It didn't make a sound, except when the door opened, and it was a man in his 60s with a cane that had a strange design on the handle. He didn't seem threatening or anything, and he didn't show any emotion. I must have fallen asleep somewhere in that time, because I had my dad come in yelling that I was going to be late for school. After school, I talked to my mum to pick me up after football, and explained it to her, describing the man and his cane. She flipped out because that night her father passed away, and I had never met this man before in my life. so there's no way for me to know what he looks like or his cane that he had for years. She doesn't even have pictures of her father in the house or anywhere that I would be able to find. This last bit, other than the main events happening, I've heard doors and cupboards open and slam shut over the years, when I've been the only one in the house since my parents usually left for work at 8 a.m. and didn't get back until at least 9 or 10. This happened about 12 years ago when I was 15-16. Me and my parents took a trip from Pennsylvania to New York City to visit a foreign exchange student called Francis. We previously hosted him. He was back in America working in a restaurant, and we wanted to spend the weekend with him and taking out to some nice places. We got a nice upgrade at our hotel and had a luxury suite that had a bedroom where my parents would sleep and a big living room where me and Francis would sleep. The rooms connected, but both also had their own entrances to the hallway that faced each other in a little nook. Francis had to work till midnight the night we got there, so my parents went to bed and I stayed up to wait for him. Shortly after midnight, I hear a knock at the door to my parents' room. I assumed Francis arrived, so I went to open the door for him before he woke up my parents. Didn't even check the peephole first. I opened the door to a large, mid-30-year-old man holding a gas can. He seemed startled that I opened the other door behind him and went, Hi, I was wondering if you could spare some money for gas. I replied, Oh, let me ask my parents. I close the door, go to the other room to wake up my mum, but she yells, Sorry, we can't help you. She definitely has better sense than me because my dumbass doesn't realize it's the middle of the night and we're on the 10th floor of a hotel. He didn't say anything in response. I checked the peephole and he was already gone. Francis showed up a half hour later and we had a great time for the rest of the weekend. But I still wonder what this guy's real intentions were, and what would have happened if one of my parents opened the door instead of me. I had the pleasure of going on the Chernobyl tour 6 years ago in May. Kiev was so incredibly beautiful. Seeing what happened is devastating, but the tour was creepy. More mosquitoes than I've ever seen in my life. Only buildings we had free range in was an old elementary school. We got a poke inside the theatre, but not past the main entrance, and we could walk the stands at their football stadium. People still live there and in part of the buffer zone. There are still shops in the green zone, which I believe is a 5-mile radius from the plant. I remember when we pulled up to the plant and got out, our tour guide said, Just so you know, this sarcophagus is very unstable and could collapse at any minute. That was my first I don't want to be here thought. On a side note, Ukrainians are some of the most hospitable, nicest and friendliest people I've ever met. I truly did not want to leave, and wish those still fighting for freedom their best of luck. I work for a power company, restoring power after storms. I was working when a lady came up complaining that her power went out. We explained to her that's why we're there, and she should have her power back soon. She said, Oh good, my son went into the basement and now I can't find him. I went with her with a flashlight down the road to a run-down house that was partially caved in. She walked inside and I went to follow. As soon as I walked into the door, she disappeared from sight. I called for her multiple times, but no one responded, so I ran back to our work truck to call for help. A man that was living on her street called to me asking what was wrong, and I told him the situation. He looked at me with a cold stare and said, a mum and her son died in that house 4 years ago. I'm still shaken to my core this very day.